The Walled, Part 1, Iron, Chapter 1. The day the wall came down. The morning it happened, his mother was baking bread. Cade remembered that before anything else, the faint scorch of butter at the bottom of the oven, the soft crackling when she turned the loaf, a thin ribbon of white smoke drifting past the kitchen window and dissolving into the August air. He was lying on his bunk, staring up at the ceiling in the early dark, listening to those sounds, thinking this would be another ordinary day. He had no reason to think otherwise. In Irongate, ordinary days came one after another in a long, unbroken chain, and nobody talked much about the possibility of the chain ending. He was 10 years old. He had never known anything different. Outside, the city was waking up the way it always woke up, Mr. Dawkins' pushcart scraped and groaned over the cobblestones on the street below. The man was 70 and still ran the only produce cart in the Eastern Quarter, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake since 4 in the morning and would be awake until 9 at night and had made his peace with that fact years ago. Across the street, Mrs. Halverson's window was open, and her voice drifted through it. "Jonah, get down here. I am not calling you again, I mean it this time, Jonah." She said this every morning. Jonah, who was 8 and therefore experienced, always came down eventually. From the speaker bolted to the lamppost at the corner of their block, the government morning broadcast was playing. A program of announcements read by a man with a bureaucrat's voice, followed by the standard morning music that lasted until 7 o'clock. The music was a composition from before the collapse, something slow and slightly too cheerful, like a hymn written for a congregation that no longer existed. Cade had heard it every morning of his life, and he knew every note of it, and he actively disliked it, and he would have noticed immediately if it had stopped playing. It hadn't stopped. Everything was the same. He rolled off the bunk and set his feet on the cold wood floor. He was small for 10, with the kind of wireness that came not from athletic training, but from being a kid who climbed everything. Shed roofs, chain-link fences, the old water tower on the south end of their block. Anything that got him higher than the street and gave him a view north. His hair stuck up at the back in a way that no amount of water ever fully resolved. His knees had the permanent gray tinge of knees that spent a lot of time on pavement. He was, in most ways that anyone would have noticed, a perfectly ordinary boy living in the interior ring of a walled city in what used to be the American Midwest, in the year 2041. When ordinary had come to mean something very specific, inside the walls, alive, accounted for, safe. He padded downstairs in his socks. His mother was standing at the stove with her back to the kitchen door. She was wearing the blue apron that had a small burn mark on the left pocket from the time she'd absent-mindedly set it too close to the gas flame, the one she always said she was going to replace and never did. Her light brown hair was pinned up at the nape of her neck with a tortoiseshell clip that Cade associated so strongly with her that years later, when he found a similar clip in a gutted pharmacy in the ruins outside Copper Wall, he had to set it down and walk away from it and not think about anything for approximately 20 minutes. She was humming, not consciously, the way people hum when they're thinking about something else. A tuneless half-melody that had no particular origin and no particular destination. On the stove, 2 eggs frying in the cast-iron pan his father had brought from Copper when they married, the one that weighed as much as a small child and had to be stored horizontally because the handle was slightly warped. The smell of oil and black pepper and the faint sweetness of the bread now cooling on the rack by the window. Morning light was starting to come through that window. Thin and pale, the kind of light that belonged specifically to August, different from September, light in a way that Cade had noticed without ever having the words to describe. "You're up early," his mother said without turning around. "Couldn't sleep. Sit down." He sat. The kitchen table was small, 4 chairs but only ever 2 in use, since his father worked the early shift at the Wall Maintenance Depot and was usually gone before Cade came downstairs. The table had a ring on it from years of coffee mugs and a long scratch along one side that Cade had made with a toy truck when he was 4. His mother had never sanded it out. He used to trace it with his finger while doing schoolwork. She brought the eggs and set them in front of him, then sat down across the table with her own coffee. She looked at him. He had seen that look 100 times, and he had never thought to examine it closely. It was just his mother's face, just the way she looked at him over breakfast. Later, he would understand that it was the look of someone taking inventory, committing details to memory with a deliberateness that had nothing ordinary about it. The specific angle of morning light on his face, the way his hair stuck up, the scratch on the table, his hands around the fork. "Mom!" "What?" "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The staring thing." She smiled. She reached across the table and pushed his hair flat in the back, which never worked, and she knew it never worked, and she did it anyway. "Eat your eggs before they get cold." He ate. Outside, Mr. Dawkins's cart reached the corner and stopped, and they could hear him arguing in a friendly way with someone about the price of cabbage, the same argument that happened every Tuesday. The morning broadcast wrapped up its list of announcements, labor allocation updates, water rationing adjustments, a reminder about the community meeting at the Northern Assembly Hall on Friday, and the morning music resumed. Mrs. Halverson called Jonah one more time. Jonah, presumably, came down. "Dad coming home tonight?" Kate asked. "Should be. His shift ends at 6. He said he'd show me the maintenance logs. He said maybe I could go with him sometime." His mother's expression shifted barely perceptibly. "We'll see," he said. I know what he said. She set her coffee cup down. "Eat, Cade." He ate. He didn't notice the shift in her expression. He was 10, and the eggs were good, and there was bread cooling by the window, and outside Mr. Dawkins was losing his argument about cabbage in the good-natured way he always lost it, and the morning was ordinary. He had no reason to think otherwise. He didn't go outside after breakfast. He told his mother he was going to play in the street, which was what she wanted to hear, and then he cut through the side alley behind their row of houses and climbed the storage shed at the end of the block. The shed belonged to an older couple named the Barnetts, who kept it locked because it held the tools for their small plot of growing space, but the lock was on the door and not on the drainage pipe that ran up the back wall. And drainage pipes, Kate had learned at the age of 7, were reliable. He had never been caught. He suspected the Barnetts knew, but had decided, in the way that older people in the inner quarters made certain quiet decisions, that it wasn't worth the argument. From the top of the shed, he could see the iron wall. It was there at the northern edge of the city, a long horizontal line and line of gray-brown steel, maybe 30 feet high at its lowest point and higher where the reinforcement buttresses stood. It ran east-west along the entire northern boundary of Irongate, which meant that if you stood in the right spot, which Cade had found in the second week of his shed roof habit, you could see both ends of it trailing off into the haze. From here, it didn't look as large as it did up close. From here, it looked almost like a feature of the landscape, like a ridge or a levee, something that had simply always been there. Beyond it, nothing. Or so the teachers said. The wasteland, the dead zone. The ruins of the world that used to exist, before the collapse, before the outbreak, before the things that came with the outbreak and had no common name yet that most people were comfortable using. The government called them anomalies. People in the streets called them the dead, which wasn't accurate but was close enough that nobody argued. Children called them zombies, which was the word from old films and books, the word that their parents tried to correct, and that stuck anyway because it was specific and children appreciated specificity in the things they were afraid of. They were out there, beyond the iron wall. The ruins were out there. The dead world was out there. That was where everything ended, or so the teachers said. Cade sat on the shed roof with his chin in his hands and looked at the iron wall and felt the thing he always felt and couldn't name. The itch in the unreachable place, the sense of a question forming that wasn't quite ready to be spoken. He was too young to call it doubt. He was too old to call it simple curiosity. It was something between the two, something that didn't have a word yet in his vocabulary. He sat there until his mother called him in for lunch. The morning was ordinary. He had no reason to think otherwise. The sirens went off at 10:14. He was back on the shed roof, lunch eaten, permission asked and received, his mother believing he was actually going to play in the street this time, which he had not done. He had been sitting up there for almost 2 hours, thinking about the wall the way he always thought about the wall when the sound started. It was not the scheduled test siren, which happened on the first Thursday of every month at noon, and which everyone in Irongate had learned to ignore. That siren had a rhythm, 3 bursts, each 10 seconds, a pause between each one, followed by a single long note that lasted 30 seconds, and then cut off. Routine, planned, ignorable. This was a single unbroken tone, and it did not stop. Cade sat up straight. The sound was coming from every speaker in the city simultaneously. He could tell because he heard it first from the speaker at their corner, and then a fraction of a second later, the same note from every other direction at once, the slight delay of distance creating a stacked, overlapping effect that was somehow worse than a clean single sound. It was the sound of a system operating at the extreme limit of the purpose it had been designed for. It was the sound of everything. He looked north. At the iron wall's base, where the steel met the packed earth of the northern boundary road, a line of brown dust was rising. He stared at it. The dust rose and spread, and behind it, he had to squint. The morning haze was still not fully burned off. The distance was nearly 2 kilometers. Behind the dust, there was movement. Something at the wall's height, something at the wall's height, and then above the wall's height. Something that continued to rise. His mind did the thing that minds do when they encounter something they cannot immediately process, which is to offer the nearest available explanation. His mind said, construction equipment. His mind said, a crane, probably, or one of the large maintenance platforms that sometimes appeared on the wall when a section needed repair. His mind offered these explanations because they were available, and because they were not frightening, and because Cade was 10 years old, and the real explanation was one that had no precedent in his direct experience, only in the histories he'd been taught at school and in the nightmares he occasionally had and refused to tell anyone about. Then the wall moved, not shook, not cracked. Moved. A section of it, a section that from this distance looked to be maybe 100 meters across, folding inward the way a door folds, slowly and then less slowly, the reinforcement buttresses on either side tilting and then toppling, the sound reaching him a full 8 seconds after the visual because it had to cross 2 kilometers of city to get to him, and sound traveled slower than light. And 8 seconds was a long time to watch something enormous fall before you heard it fall. The sound, when it arrived, was not like anything Cade had a comparison for. It was below the range of what he would have called a noise. It was more like the air itself had been struck, the way a bell is struck, and as if the entire city were the inside of a bell, and something had hit the outside of it. He felt it in his back teeth. He felt it in his chest. He was off the shed roof and running for his house before he had made a conscious decision to do either. His mother was at the kitchen window. She was still holding the dish towel she'd been using when the sirens started. She hadn't set it down. She'd just moved from the counter to the window and stood there holding it, looking out at the street where people were already running. Not yet the full stream, not yet the flood. This was the first wave. The ones who were close enough to the northern quarter to have seen or heard something directly, the ones whose first instinct was to move rather than to stand and make sense of what they'd seen. She turned when Cade came through the door. "We have to go," he said. "Your father—" "Mom!" He grabbed her hand. Her hand was warm and dry and familiar, and the dish towel fell to the floor when he pulled her. "We have to go right now." She looked at him. Something moved across her face, the same expression she'd had at breakfast, the inventory expression, but accelerated now, compressed, the way a long breath gets compressed when there isn't time for a long breath. Then she set her jaw, and she came with him. They made it 2 blocks before the street became impassable. People were streaming south from the direction of the iron wall, and the side streets were filling to join them. and what had started as a stream was rapidly becoming something closer to a flood. The quality of the noise had changed. Less shouting now, more of a continuous roar, the sound of many hundreds of feet on pavement, and many hundreds of voices all overlapping, individual words no longer distinguishable, just a collective human sound that had no message except, "Move, move, move." Cade's mother had lost a shoe somewhere in the first block. He didn't see it happen. He only realized afterward that she was running with one shoe on and one foot in a sock that was rapidly becoming black from the pavement. He pulled her hand, and she came, and he pulled harder when she slowed, and she came harder. And this was how they got through the first 2 blocks. Him pulling forward, and her following, and the crowd pushing from behind, and they were moving. They were in the stream. They were going south toward Copper Wall, and that was right. That was where you went. Everyone knew that was where you went. Then she fell. The curb at the Milburn intersection was higher than the surrounding pavement, an old design, pre-collapse, built for a city that had expectations about drainage that no longer applied. She caught it with her shoeless foot, and she went down, not a stumble, a full fall, both knees and both palms. And by the time Cade had stopped and turned and started pulling at her arm to get her upright, the crowd had closed around them, and they were in the middle of it, and it was moving, and they were not. He got her up. She was hurt. He could see it in her face, the brief wince she tried to suppress, the way she put her weight differently. But she was standing. They were standing, and Raven Ashford came out of the alley on their left. He knew her the way you knew everyone on your block, by sight and by name and by a handful of specific memories, the way neighbors accumulate small knowledge of each other over years without ever quite becoming friends. He knew she lived at the far end of the block, that her mother worked at the medical station and was therefore probably already at the station or already trying to get to it, that her father had been a wall guard and was gone since last year. He knew she was 8, which was younger than him, and that she had a scar above her right eyebrow from falling off a bicycle in June, and that the bicycle now lived in the alley behind her building because she had refused to ride it again after the fall, not out of fear but out of what looked very much like principle. She was running alone. She came out of the alley, and she saw him, and she saw the crowd, and she didn't slow down. He reached out and took her hand. He did not plan this. He did not think, there is a child alone and I should help her. He just did it, the way you sometimes do things before the thinking part of your brain has weighed in. And she grabbed his hand back with a grip that was remarkably certain for an 8-year-old in the middle of a collapsing city. And they were moving again, all 3 of them, his mother's hand in his left and Raven's in his right. They made it another half block. Then the crowd shifted, a surge from the east, a group coming out of one of the side streets with enough momentum to push into the mainstream sideways. And in the press of shoulders and elbows and bodies moving in 3 different directions simultaneously, the hand on his left was there and then was not. He turned. His mother was 7 feet away. The crowd between them was thick enough to stop a wagon. People were moving both ways, pushing and pulling, nobody giving way because nobody had way to give. He started to push back into it. Raven's hand tightened on his. Cade. My mother? Cade! Her voice was not a child's voice. Or it was, but it had something in it that he had never heard in a child's voice before, something flat and certain, and very much already acquainted with loss. We can't. He looked across the crowd. 7 feet. It might as well have been the width of the iron wall. His mother looked back at him. She was standing in the current of people being jostled, one bare foot black from the road, the dish towel no longer anywhere. She was looking at him with an expression that he would spend years trying to reconstruct precisely and never quite succeed. Not panic, not helplessness, not even grief. More like the expression of someone who has already made a decision that cost them everything and has decided to make it with grace. Her lips moved. He could not hear her over the noise. He thought she said, "Go." Raven pulled him, and he let himself be pulled, and he looked back once. And she was still standing there, looking after him, and then the crowd closed, and he could not see her anymore. They ran. There was nothing else. There was just running, the two of them, through streets that were emptying in some directions and flooding in others, past overturned market stalls and abandoned bicycles and a child's drawing that someone had dropped in the road, and that was being walked over again and again and again. The sound from the north was continuous now. Not just the sirens, which had been joined by other sounds, the low ongoing groan of the structural collapse spreading through the wall section, the sounds that a city makes when it is trying to process a fact that is too large for it. Cade ran and did not think about his mother and did not think about anything, and Raven ran beside him and did not speak and did not let go of his hand. Copper wall appeared ahead of them, at the end of a long, straight street. It was 60 feet high here at the southern gate, higher than the iron wall, reinforced differently. A later design, built with the knowledge of what the iron wall had faced and not held. It was lit with arc lights even in the daytime, the kind of lights that were on all night and never turned off. And in those lights the gate was visible from blocks away. A controlled channel of bodies moving through the bottleneck, guards in position, the whole system doing the thing it had been built to do. They moved through the gate at 11:15 in the morning. The gate sealed behind them with a sound like a vault being closed. Cade stopped in the middle of the receiving yard and just stood there for a moment. Around him, hundreds of people in various states of shock and injury and grief, the specific controlled chaos of a mass emergency that has protocols and is following them. Somewhere a woman was screaming a name over and over and not receiving an answer. Somewhere a man was sitting on the ground with his head in his hands, in total stillness, while everyone moved around him. Somewhere, a pair of very small children were standing hand in hand near a fence post, looking at everything with wide, identical eyes, not crying, not speaking, waiting for an adult who had told them to wait here and who had not yet come back. Raven stood beside him. She had let go of his hand when they stopped. They were standing close enough that he could feel the heat of her in the morning air. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke. He didn't cry. He would ask himself about this later more than once. Why didn't he cry? He had just lost his mother. He had watched her disappear into a crowd. He was 10 years old and standing in a stranger's receiving yard with a girl he barely knew, and his father was somewhere he didn't know, and his house was somewhere behind a gate that was not going to open again today. Why didn't he cry? He didn't have a good answer. He thought it was because crying required a certain kind of certainty. The certainty that a thing was finished, that a loss was confirmed and complete, and he hadn't reached that certainty yet. What had happened in the Milburn intersection could still be undone. His mother could still be somewhere in the crowd, still coming through the gate. His father could still come home from his shift at the wall maintenance depot. The chain of ordinary days could still resume. He didn't cry because he was still waiting for ordinary to reassert itself. It didn't. They were given space in a gymnasium that had been converted to a temporary shelter. Rows of cots set up with mechanical efficiency, the Copper Wall Emergency Administration clearly having rehearsed this scenario at enough times to execute it without confusion. Someone gave Kate a blanket. Someone gave Raven a pair of socks because she still had her shoes and they had noticed he had none, and then they had mixed up who needed what and given the socks to Raven, and Raven had taken them without pointing out the error because it had seemed unkind to add complications to the situation. She had given them to Cade later, when the person had gone. They sat on adjacent cots. For a long time they didn't speak. People came and went around them. Registration happening at the far end of the gym. Medical stations operating in the side hallway. Food being distributed from a table near the doors. The overhead lights were the institutional kind. Bright and flat and honest about nothing, and under them everyone looked equally gray and used. A boy Cade didn't know was lying on a cot, 3 rows over and crying with a consistency and commitment that suggested he was not going to stop soon. A group of older men were sitting in a cluster near the far wall, speaking quietly, using the measured tones of people going over a shared catastrophe from multiple angles, trying to make it add up to something that held still when you looked at it. "Is there anyone you need to find?" Raven asked. "My dad. Where was he?" "Wall Maintenance Depot, North Sector." He paused. "By the wall." Raven was quiet. "He might have gotten out before it happened," Cade said. "He might have. He probably—" He stopped. Raven didn't say anything. She didn't offer the reassurances that adults often offered in these moments, the things that were said to soften the waiting rather than to tell the truth. She was 8 years old, and she had already been waiting for over a year for her own father to come back from a wall assignment, and she had arrived at a particular understanding of what that waiting meant that most children her age had not yet reached. She understood that he was not the same as he will. She sat with Cade in the flat institutional light, and she didn't say anything false, and that, in its way, was more useful than most of what adults around them were saying. That night, Iron Gate burned. They could see it from a gap in the gymnasium's high windows. The northern sky lit orange-pink, the specific color of a fire that was very large and very far away, the kind of color that looked almost beautiful if you did not know what it was. People took turns standing at the windows and looking at it. Some of them cried. Some of them said the names of streets or buildings quietly, the way you say the name of something you are watching. Die. Cade found a way up to the gymnasium roof through a window in the stairwell, the kind of roof access that existed in every building if you were willing to look for it. He didn't ask permission. He just went up. Raven followed him. The roof of the gymnasium was flat and slightly gritty underfoot, and it gave them a clear view north. Iron Gate was burning in multiple places now. The fire had moved from the breach in the iron wall inward, following whatever it followed, taking what it took. The arc lights at Copper Wall's northern face were blazing to their full capacity, and in that combined light and firelight, the scene had a terrible clarity. They could see the top of the iron wall, or what was left of it, silhouetted against the orange sky. They could see the shape that had come through it, distant now, moving further north, a shape that Cade's mind continued to resist categorizing directly, that it continued to offer him alternatives for, because the correct categorization was not something that 10-year-old boys in walled cities had been built to accommodate. He sat on the roof and looked. Raven sat beside him and looked. After a long time, she said, "Your mother." Not a question, not a consolation. Just an acknowledgement, the way you might mark a point on a map. "Yeah," he said. "My dad," she said, "last year. He didn't come back from a patrol assignment." And he turned to look at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the fire in the way she watched most things, with a directness that was not cold but simply clear. No filter between the thing and her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, because it was the only thing he had. She shook her head slightly. The small motion bird of someone who has moved past the point where sorrow requires an apology. "It's just what happens," she said. He looked back at the fire. He sat with that for a while. The enormity of it and the ordinariness of it. The way she had said, "It's just what happens," not bitterly, not with resignation, just with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had understood a fact and incorporated it and was living around it. He had not incorporated it yet. The fact of his mother in the crowd at Milburn was still sitting in his chest in a raw, unprocessed way, waiting for him to find the container for it. He didn't find it that night. He would not find it for a long time. But he felt something else that night, something separate from the grief, something that had nothing to do with his mother or with Raven or with the fire. It was the thing he had felt every morning on the shed roof, the itch in the unreachable place, the half-formed question. Only now it had gotten larger and sharper, and he could almost name it. What was out there? What was really out there? Because the thing that had broken through the iron wall was not nothing. The world beyond the wall was not empty. The teachers had said the dead world, the ruined world, the finished world, and whatever had walked through that wall was not the product of a finished world. It was specific and enormous and purposeful in a way that implied something Cade did not yet have the framework to articulate. He sat on the roof until the fire died down to embers, and the sky went from orange to red to the ordinary gray of early morning. By the time he climbed back down, something had hardened in him. He would call it hatred, because that was the closest word. He would carry it for many years before he understood what it actually was. His father never came home. Not that day, not the day after, not the week after. The wall maintenance depot at the North Sector had been directly in the path of the collapse. The administration released a list, eventually, of individuals who had been on shift that morning and could not be accounted for. His father's name was on it. The list said unaccounted for. It did not say dead. Cade read the word unaccounted for several times and decided that it meant what it meant and moved on. Raven found him sitting on the gym roof again that evening, looking at nothing, now that there was no fire to look at. "My aunt is in the Western Quarter," she said. "She says we can stay. You and me both." He looked at her. "You don't have to," she said. "The administration will—" "Okay," he said. She nodded. She sat down beside him. "Why?" he asked after a while. "Why what?" "Why both of us? Why not just you?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about most things, like the question deserved to be taken seriously. "Because you don't have anywhere either," she said finally, "and because I already know you." He looked out at the place where Irongate had been. "Okay," he said again. They sat on the roof until it got dark, and then they climbed down and walked to the Western Quarter together. And that was the beginning of the arrangement that would last for the next 5 years, and that neither of them ever gave a name because it didn't need one. Chapter 2. 5 years later. In those 5 years, his father did not die. He disappeared. There was a difference, and the difference mattered in ways that Cade spent a long time refusing to examine. Death was a closed door. Disappearance was a door left ajar, the specific discomfort of something that had not been resolved, that existed in a permanent conditional tense, that required you to hold two incompatible possibilities simultaneously and prevented you from fully committing to either. His father was gone. His father might, conceivably, not be completely gone. His father was in the same category as the rest of the unaccounted for from the North Sector collapse, a category that the administration never officially closed, because closing it would have required admitting things they were not prepared to admit. On the third day, after the wall came down, before Cade and Raven went to the Western Quarter, a notebook had appeared on the cot beside Cade's while he was at the food distribution line. He had come back to find it there, with a scrap of paper clipped to the cover. "I'm sorry, son." His father's handwriting. He knew it, the slight forward slant. The way the lowercase g always looked like it was in a hurry. He had held the notebook for a long time. He had put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, and he had carried it to the Western Quarter, and he had put it at the bottom of the drawer under his extra set of clothes, and he had not taken it out again. Not once, not in 5 years. He was not ready for whatever was in it. He understood this about himself clearly enough that he didn't argue with it. The room they lived in was in Block C of Copper Wall, which was the old designation for the eastern residential sections just inside the wall's midpoint, not the worst housing in Copper, which was the temporary shelters that had been erected immediately after the Irongate evacuation and never quite deconstructed, and not the better housing of the western blocks where people with skills the administration valued tended to live. Block C was functional. The walls were solid. The roof didn't leak unless it rained very hard for several days in a row. The shared toilet facilities in the hallway worked most of the time. The room they rented was 7 square meters with a window that looked east, and 2 single beds pushed to opposite walls, and a pine table that had previously belonged to the elderly woman downstairs, who had given it to them after her eyesight went bad enough that she couldn't read at a table anymore, and it was therefore taking up space she needed for other things. Nobody asked why a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old were living alone. This was Copper Wall after the collapse, after the Iron Gate evacuation. The standard household configuration was whatever configuration the people inside it had arrived at through necessity. There were families with 8 people in rooms this size. There were single adults who had lost everything and rebuilt nothing. There were children who had ended up together for reasons that were complicated and that didn't require outside commentary. Cade and Raven were not remarkable. They had a room. They paid the block rent from their combined work credits. They showed up to their labor assignments. They didn't cause trouble. The administration had no interest in the specifics. They had worked out over 5 years how to inhabit a shared space without requiring anything from each other that either of them wasn't prepared to give. Raven was up before dawn most mornings, not from insomnia, but from some internal clock that seemed to consider 6 o'clock a reasonable time to be active, a position that Cade found philosophically questionable but had stopped arguing with. She came back with their bread rations before he was properly conscious. He cooked in the evenings, or what passed for cooking, given the ingredients available, boiled grains, whatever vegetables the block distribution included that week. Occasionally a piece of protein from the communal allocation if they had enough credits. He washed the bowls. She mended the clothes. When the kerosene burner needed a new wick, he replaced it. When the window latch started sticking, she fixed it with a piece of wire from the maintenance scrap pile. They talked about practical things. They talked about their days. In the evenings, sometimes they sat on opposite sides of the pine table, and Cade read whatever he could get from the block library exchange, and Raven disassembled small mechanical things and put them back together, which was something she did not for any particular purpose, but because it seemed to settle something in her that unsettling things had disturbed. They did not talk about Iron Gate. They did not talk about the morning of the collapse or about the people they had lost or about the particular quality of grief that came from losing people to something so large and so sudden that you never got to say goodbye. They didn't talk about these things, not because they had agreed not to, but because there was nothing to say that would add to what they already knew. And what they already knew, they carried in ways that had gradually become habitable, the way you learn to inhabit a scar. Elliot Crane came into their lives in the winter when Cade was 13. More precisely, Cade found Elliot Crane in an alley behind the Eastern Market, backed against a brick wall by 3 boys from the labor allocation barracks who had decided, based on criteria that Cade never fully established, that Elliot deserved whatever was happening to him. One of the 3 had something sharp. The other 2 had the posture of people who had already decided how this was going to go, and were enjoying the certainty of it. Cade had been cutting through the alley to save time on the way home from his afternoon assignment at the wall reinforcement works. He stopped because one of the 3 had something sharp, and sharp things in alleys created situations that he had learned to be cautious about. And caution in his experience required him to assess whether he was walking into something or past something. He assessed that he was walking into something. "Hey," he said. The 3 turned. What followed was brief and unpleasant in the specific way of fights that one participant doesn't care about winning, and the other 3 care about more than the situation warrants. The boy with the sharp thing used it on Cade's left forearm. Not deeply, just a line of fire along the outer edge that bled enough to be dramatic without being serious. Cade hit the person holding the sharp thing with the heel of his hand because he had learned from previous encounters that the goal in a fight you didn't want to be in was to make the other person decide they didn't want to be in it either. And for that purpose, a sharp, direct impact to the face was more persuasive than technique. The 3 of them left. Cade looked at the boy against the wall. Thin, 12, maybe 13. Glasses with a cracked left lens, the crack fresh, probably from this encounter. In both hands, held with a grip that suggested he had maintained it even during the preceding unpleasantness. A folded sheet of paper. His face had the expression of someone who was evaluating the situation they had just exited rather than the situation they were currently in. "Are you hurt?" Cade asked. "Not seriously." The boy stood and brushed his jacket off. His voice was measured, the voice of someone reporting accurately, rather than performing calm. "Thank you." "What did they want?" The boy looked down at the paper in his hands, then up, with the slight delay of someone who had forgotten he was holding it. "This." Cade looked at the paper. It was folded into a rough square, worn at the creases in a way that suggested it had been folded and unfolded many times. "What is it?" "A map." He unfolded it, carefully, as if demonstrating something. The paper was covered in pencil drawings, not random doodles but an actual map, streets, walls, landmarks, scale indicators in the margins. In the upper right corner, where the paper was partly worn away, he had written, "Beyond the iron wall, speculative." Of the territory I believe exists outside the walls. "You've never been outside." "No." "So it's made up." "It's theoretical," the boy said, with a slight precision that was not defensive but was corrective. "Based on what I can deduce from available sources, pre-collapse maps, the movement patterns of patrol teams, atmospheric and agricultural indicators that suggest certain things about the terrain to the north, it's incomplete, but it's not arbitrary." Cade looked at him. "They hit you over a theoretical map." "They said I was showing off." He folded the paper back along its creases. "They may have had a point. I was explaining it to someone who hadn't asked." Despite himself, Cade almost laughed. "You live in Block C?" "No, I'm with my aunt in the labor barracks on 7th. My parents were at Irongate." A pause. "Mine too," Cade said. The boy looked at him with the particular attention of someone recognizing a category they belong to. Then he held out his hand. Elliot Crane. Cade Voss. They shook hands in the alley behind the Eastern Market in the way that people sometimes shook hands when they had just established, without ceremony, that they were going to know each other. Cade brought him home that evening without particularly planning to. There was no moment of decision, no point at which he said to himself, "I will invite this person into my living situation." It was more that they were walking in the same direction, and it seemed impolite to stop walking together, and then they were on the stairs of the Block C building, and then Cade was opening the door, and then Elliot was inside the 7-square-meter room with the pine table, and the 2 beds and the window that looked east. Raven was at the table when they came in. She looked at Elliot, looked at Cade, looked at the cut on Cade's arm that had bled through his sleeve and was now drying brown, looked at Elliot again. "Who's this?" she asked. Elliot. There was a thing. Some people in the alley. Raven looked at Elliot with the evaluating attention she applied to most things, calm and thorough and without much visible sentiment. Elliot looked back at her with similar attention, and Cade had the feeling of watching 2 people run rapid, silent calculations about each other. "Your arm needs to be cleaned," Raven said to Cade. "It's fine." "It needs to be cleaned." She stood and went to the corner where they kept the first aid tin. "Sit down," she said to the room in general, which Cade understood to include Elliot. Elliot sat on the floor. He took the map out and unfolded it on his knee and studied it with the air of someone resuming an interrupted task. "You draw that?" Raven asked, coming back with the tin. "Yes." He didn't look up. "Of what?" "Outside the walls." He turned the map slightly to accommodate her angle of view. "This section here is projection based on watershed patterns from pre-collapse data. The scale may be off in the eastern range. I'm still working out the northern boundary." Raven looked at it for a moment. Then she sat on the edge of Cade's bed and began cleaning his cut with an efficiency that communicated she was not going to be gentle about it, and that he should not expect her to be. "Why?" she asked. Elliot looked up. "Why what?" "Why make a map of something you've never been to?" He considered the question seriously, in the way he considered most things. "Because I need to understand what's there before I can understand what's happening here," he said. The walls don't explain themselves. The information we're given doesn't explain itself. If I can build an accurate model of what's outside, then the things happening inside start to make more sense. Raven looked at him over Cade's shoulder, where she was pressing a pad of cloth to the cut. "Does it?" she said. "Make more sense." "Not yet," he said. "But it will." Cade winced. "Stop moving," Raven said. Elliot stayed for dinner. Dinner was boiled grain with a piece of dried protein and some root vegetables from the block distribution, divided 3 ways without discussion. Then it was late, and the block curfew had activated the outdoor locks, and there was, practically speaking, no reason for Elliot to be anywhere but where he was. He fell asleep at the table at around 9 o'clock, his head on his folded arms, the map still spread out beside him. In the morning, Cade came downstairs to find him sitting at the window, adding a new section to the map in the thin, early light. "I told my aunt I might be staying somewhere else for a while," Elliot said, without turning around. Cade got water for the burner. "When did you talk to her?" "Before I came yesterday. She doesn't need the space. She said it was fine." Cade looked at the back of his head, at the map being carefully extended along its northern edge, at the pencil moving with the precision of someone who had thought about exactly what they were drawing before they drew it. "Okay," Cade said. The room became 9 square meters in the spring, when the woman downstairs said they could use the storage space next door. She made the offer while delivering a covered dish of something she had made and wanted to get rid of before it went bad, which was how most of her generosity was presented. As a problem she was solving rather than a gift she was giving. Cade had learned to accept it in the spirit it was offered. 3 people, 9 meters, a pine table, and a map that was being revised continuously in light of new information. It wasn't much. It was enough. The night before the first day of training class 104, Cade climbed onto a roof. The habit was so old it required no decision. Any roof sufficiently high, any night when the thing in his chest was moving around and refusing to be still. He found a way up, and he looked north. 5 years of this. The view had changed. From Block C, farther into the interior of Copper Wall, you couldn't see as clearly toward the old Iron Wall position, the city intervening with its blocks and towers, and the new construction at the northern defense perimeter. But the habit was not really about the view. It was about the orientation, the act of facing north and sitting with whatever he found there. What he usually found there was the question he couldn't answer yet. Elliot came up after him. Not quietly. Elliot was not built for quietness on ladders, being someone whose relationship with physical space was primarily conceptual, but with the dogged determination of someone who had decided that where Cade went was where the relevant conversation happened to be. He sat down beside Cade on the cold roof tiles and pulled his knees up. They sat with the city spread out below them and the dark horizon to the north where Iron Gate had been. And in the distance, the faint lit line of the current Iron Wall section being rebuilt, the work crews doing overnight shifts under arc lights, visible from here as a suggestion of brightness at the edge of sight. "Do you wonder what's out there?" Elliot asked. Cade looked at the horizon. The question was familiar, not because anyone had asked it before, but because he had been asking it internally every day for 5 years, and hearing it said aloud produced a strange doubling effect, like hearing a thought he'd been certain was only his own. "No," he said. Elliot turned slightly. "I don't wonder," Cade said. "I know what I think is out there. I think there's nothing worth leaving intact. I think the thing that came through the Iron Wall and the things like it are what happened to a world that forgot how to protect itself. And I think every one of them needs to be destroyed. That's what you believe is out there. That's what I know." Elliot was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the horizon too now, with the particular focus of someone running calculations. "And if you're wrong," he said. "Then I'll find out I was wrong," Cade said, "and deal with it." "Is that why you chose the Scouts?" "Yes." He looked at Elliot. "You?" The question seemed to require real thought. Elliot reached into his jacket and took out the map. Always in the same inner pocket, always accessible, the paper soft with use, and he looked at it in the darkness where it was barely readable. "Because you might be right," he said, "and I might be right, and the only way to know is to go and look." He folded the map back along its creases. "If you're right and it's all death and ruins out there, then I need to know that. It changes everything I've been trying to model." A pause. "And if I'm right and there's something more out there than what they've told us..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Then what?" Cade asked. "Then," Elliot said quietly, "that changes everything else." They sat on the roof for another hour. The arc lights at the construction site pulsed softly in the distance. The city breathed around them. Below, Raven came to the back door and looked up, saw them on the roof, and went back inside without saying anything. She had her own relationship with the north-facing Knights, and it did not require company. Tomorrow they would walk through the gate of the Scout compound for the first time, and the 5 years of waiting would be over, and whatever came after would begin. Tonight was still tonight. Cade sat with his question, and the darkness and the distant light and the city of people sleeping around him who did not know what he was going to do or why, and he held the hardened thing in his chest, and he thought about his mother in the Millburn intersection, and he thought about the shape that had walked through the iron wall, and he thought, "I am coming." He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. Chapter 3, Coder, Class 104. On the first day of training class, 104 Sawyer E. City Vex walked into the lecture hall and sat down. Not at the front, not on the raised platform with the podium and the authority-conferring position above his audience. He pulled a chair out from one of the front row desks, turned it to face the room, sat down in it the way a man sits down for a meal he is not particularly looking forward to, and put both hands flat on his knees. Then he looked at them. 37 recruits. Ages ranged from 15 to 19, the standard intake window for Copperwall's military training program. They had been sorted, assigned, tested through the preliminary evaluation process, and arrived here because they had met the baseline requirements for the Scouts track. Not the easiest track, not the hardest, but the one with the smallest graduating class and the highest casualty rate of any branch in the wall defense structure. They knew this. They had signed the forms that told them this. Some of them were here because of it, some of them were here despite it. None of them were here without having read the number. They sat and they waited for him to begin. He sat and he looked at them. A minute passed. 2. The quality of the silence in the room changed. At first it was the expectant silence of people waiting for something to start, and then it became something more uncertain. And then it became something that Cade, sitting in the third row on the left, recognized as the silence of people who were being made uncomfortable and couldn't identify the source of the discomfort. He had learned to recognize that silence in other people, because he had learned to recognize when he himself was being positioned at a disadvantage, and one of the ways that happened was when someone controlled the timing of things in a room you were in. He looked at Sawyer Vex. Sawyer Vex looked back at him. Vex was perhaps 45. He was not large in the way that authority sometimes displayed itself. Not the physical bulk that some unit commanders cultivated as a form of communication. He was built lean, with the particular efficiency of someone whose relationship with their body was functional rather than demonstrative. His hair had gone silver early and entirely, cropped close. He had a scar that ran from the point of his chin to just below his left ear that was old enough to have faded to a thin white line. And the story of it was not something anyone in the room knew, and it was not something he had offered. He wore the standard Scout commander's uniform without insignia, because he had removed all his insignia at some point that preceded Cade's knowledge of him, and no one in the command structure had apparently decided to make an issue of it. His eyes, looking back at Catides, were patient without being gentle. The patience of someone who has concluded that time is not a resource to be conserved, but a tool to be deployed. 9 minutes and 40 seconds after he sat down, Someone in the back row shifted their chair and the sound broke the seal of whatever he had been building. "Most of you will die," he said. His voice was not raised. It was perfectly calibrated for the room. Not the performance of control, but the actual thing. He spoke the way someone speaks who has said a sentence many times and no longer feels the need to put feeling into it. Not most of you today, not most of you this month, but over the course of your service in the Scout Division, statistically, the probability favors it. I don't tell you this to frighten you. I tell you this because people who understand the odds they're operating under make better decisions than people who don't. The question isn't whether you'll die. The question is what you'll die for. He paused. There are two kinds of death in the Scouts. The first kind is dying because you weren't good enough, because you lack the training or the information or the judgment to handle what you faced. That kind can be prevented. That's what the training is for. The second kind is dying despite being good enough, because this work has a probability problem that no amount of competence can entirely solve, and eventually the probability catches up. That kind can't be prevented. I won't pretend it can. He paused again. What I will do is train you to die the second way if you die, because the alternative is a waste of everything you are. He stood up. "Yard," he said. 8 o'clock. He left. Cade filed out with the others into the yard, where the afternoon light was long and slanted, and the compound's older recruits were running a circuit around the perimeter in a formation that looked like it was supposed to be uniform and wasn't quite. He stood in the loose group of Class 104 and looked around. He was looking for the people he would need to know. This was something he had been doing since Iron Gate, assessing a space for the people in it who mattered, the ones who would be relevant to whatever was going to happen next. It was a habit born of necessity and refined through the years in Block C, where knowing which adults were reliable and which administrators were worth approaching and which people in the block had resources they would share under the right circumstances was practically important. In a room of 37 people, most of them would be incidental. A few would not. He found Dex Harlow first because Dex was hard to miss. Not just the size, which was considerable, but the way he occupied space. Some large people occupied space insistently, taking it up as a demonstration of their right to it. Dex moved through the yard with a steadiness that was not aggressive, that had nothing to prove. He was currently holding a door open for two people behind him who had not asked him to and who had probably not noticed he was doing it. This small thing Cade would remember later, long after everything else had shifted and the context of it had changed completely. He would remember that the first thing he noticed about Dex Harlow was that he held a door open for people who didn't ask. Beside Dex, a step back and slightly to his left, was Colt Fenn, taller than Dex by 4 or 5 inches, with the look of someone who had grown quickly and not quite finished adjusting to the height, a slight forward curve to the shoulders, as if he were habitually ducking a doorframe that wasn't there. He was looking at the ground in the way of someone who found large open spaces with many people in them, an environment requiring some internal management. When someone spoke to him, one of the other recruits, a question about the afternoon schedule, he answered directly and quietly and returned to looking at the ground. Lyra Steele was standing at the south edge of the yard with her arms crossed and her back to the wall, watching the room. She had the stillness of someone who had decided that movement was information and therefore not to be given away unnecessarily. When her eyes passed over Cade's, they didn't slow, they didn't register, they continued their sweep of the yard with the same consistent attention she was giving everything else. This was information in itself. And then there was Wren Calloway. Wren was standing near the water station, eating something she had produced from somewhere, talking to 2 other recruits with a relaxed openness that suggested she had known them for years and had probably met them 20 minutes ago. She had the natural sociability of someone who genuinely found other people interesting and had not yet encountered reason to revise this position, which in Copper Wall after the evacuation was either innocence or a very carefully maintained stance. When she laughed, and she laughed twice in the 2 minutes Cade was watching, it was complete, unself-conscious, the laugh of someone who was not performing pleasure but experiencing it, He was going to stop watching her and look somewhere else, and then she turned and saw him watching and waved. Not shyly, just a wave. The wave of someone who noticed they'd been noticed and found it unremarkable. He looked away. The first 6 months was structured around a principle that Sawyer Vex stated once and did not restate. We are not building soldiers, we are building people who can survive what soldiers cannot. The distinction mattered. Soldiers operated within a structure that told them what to do and when to do it. Scouts operated in the spaces between structures, where the information was incomplete and the support was absent, and the decisions had to be made by the person present without recourse to someone higher up the chain because there was no higher up available. This required a different kind of training. Not less discipline, but differently applied discipline. Discipline toward judgment rather than compliance. Mornings were physical. Running, climbing, close-quarter combat, weapons handling, endurance work in various weather conditions. Vex ran these sessions himself, usually without speaking, demonstrating what he wanted done, and then watching it be done and then demonstrating the correction without editorial comment. His method of criticism was to stand beside you and do the thing correctly at half speed until you understood where your version had gone wrong. Afternoons were tactical and cognitive. Map reading, threat assessment, zombie behavior patterns, historical case studies of scout missions, successful and unsuccessful both. The unsuccessful ones received more detailed analysis. In a session on a mission that had lost 14 of 18 scouts 3 years prior, Vex stopped the debrief at the point of the critical decision and made the class argue about it for 2 hours before revealing what the actual outcome had been. The argument was the lesson. Evenings were their own time, which Vex treated as a resource as important as the formal training. Rest, social integration, whatever processing the individuals needed to do. He had a theory about this that he mentioned once, that the capacity to function under extreme stress was not built in moments of stress but in the recovery periods between them. You could not train someone to be present if you never gave them space to be absent. Cade spent his evenings with Elliot and Raven, usually on whatever roof was accessible, usually in a version of their pre-class routine, except that the content of their conversations had shifted. Elliot was updating the map constantly now, incorporating what he was learning about scout patrol routes and zombie movement patterns, and the specific geography of the zones they were being prepared to enter. Raven was studying close combat technique in the evenings beyond what the sessions required, practicing forms against a wooden post she had set up in the corner of their room, her movements becoming faster and more exact with each week. Cade was doing his own variation of this, not technique specifically, but something harder to name. He was working out what he believed, what he was doing here and why, what the metal thing in his chest wanted. Wren, by this point, had become one of the constants. She had arrived at their roof access point one evening in the second month, apparently following Elliot, who had apparently mentioned in passing that the roof had a good view of the training ground layout, which was information relevant to a map extension project he was undertaking. She had looked at the view, agreed it was useful, and remained for 2 hours because the conversation had been better than she expected. After that, she came back. Cade had not invited her, and had not invited her, which in the social grammar of their small group meant she was welcome. She had a gift for conversation that was different from Elliot's in kind. Elliot's gift was for precision. He moved conversations toward clarity, toward definition, toward the point where the thing being discussed was as well understood as current information allowed. Wren's gift was for texture. She made conversations feel like something you were inside rather than something you were solving. She asked questions that were not interrogative but generative, questions that made you realize you had thoughts about a thing that you hadn't known you had thoughts about. The night that Cade most remembered, they were on the roof in the third month, and the night was cold, and Wren had somehow produced a second blanket from somewhere. She had a gift for producing things from somewhere, and they were sharing it while Elliot sat apart from them, immune to cold in the specific way of people whose attention was elsewhere. "My dad used to say," Wren said, "that the worst part wasn't not knowing what was out there. The worst part was not being allowed to wonder." Cade looked at her. "He meant the official position," she continued. "The whole thing, the world beyond the walls, is dangerous. The world beyond the walls is destroyed. Wondering about the world beyond the walls is not productive." He thought that was the actual harm, not the walls. The instruction, not to be curious about what was on the other side of them. "Your dad sounds like Elliot," Cade said. Elliot, from his separate section of roof, said, "I'll take that." Wren smiled. He was stubborn about certain things. He said knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be rationed. She adjusted the blanket. He wasn't a revolutionary or anything. He just had a thing about being told not to know. Cade was quiet. "Do you have that?" Wren asked. "The wanting to know?" "I have wanting to kill things," he said. "I know." She wasn't bothered by this. She had heard him say it before. But underneath that, he thought about it. It was not a question he answered automatically. "Maybe," he said. "I don't know what it looks like when you clean it up." "Clean what up?" "The wanting to kill things. If you take that out." He was speaking carefully, the way he spoke when he was not sure of what he was going to say until it was said. "What's underneath?" "I haven't looked at it." "Why not?" "Because the wanting to kill things is useful," he said, "and I'm afraid the other thing isn't." A long pause. The cold moved through the blanket slowly, evening out the temperature. "That might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me," Wren said. "Don't tell anyone." She laughed, the complete, full laugh. He looked at the horizon. The thing underneath the wanting to kill things stayed where it was, unexamined, but for the first time he had acknowledged its existence, which was not nothing. On selection day, Sawyer Vex found Cade in the corridor outside the medical bay, where Cade was waiting for Raven to finish getting a shoulder wrap replaced after the sparring session had done something to an already existing strain. "Scouts," Vex said. "Yes, sir." Vex looked at him with the patient, measuring attention that Cade had come to understand was his default register. Not a special focus he applied to particular things, but the baseline way he occupied a space with another person in it. "I know why you want to go outside," he said. "You want to find the things that took your mother, and you want to kill them." "Yes, sir." "That's a reason. It's not a purpose." He paused. "Do you understand the difference?" Cade thought about it. "A reason is why you start. A purpose is what you do when the reason doesn't cover it." Vex looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Exactly." He turned to go. "Sir." He stopped. "What's yours?" Cade asked. It was a question that might have been impertinent and might not have been, and Vex looked at him with the expression of someone deciding which category it fell into. "The same reason," Vex said finally. "Different people." He looked at the floor. "I'm still working on the purpose." He walked away. Cade stood in the corridor and thought about this for a while. Chapter 4. Wren, the night before their first field mission, nobody in the dormitory slept. This was not acknowledged. The acknowledgement would have required people to say something true about what they were feeling, and in a barracks of 26 young people the night before their first real exposure to the outside world, truth about feeling was currency nobody wanted to spend. So instead they made small noises, the careful sounds of people trying to appear to be sleeping while not sleeping, and the room had the quality of a collective held breath. Wren Calloway, lying in her bunk in the women's dormitory, stared at the ceiling and thought about her sister. Petra was 7 now. She'd been 2 when the iron wall came down, which meant she had no real memories of Iron Gate, which meant she had no real memories of the world before the evacuation, which meant Copper Wall was simply the world to her, its particular constraints and routines the nature of things rather than an adaptation to catastrophe. She accepted ration lines with the equanimity of someone who had never had a reason to find them unusual. She did her labor preparation schooling with the equanimity of someone who had never considered there might be other ways to spend childhood. She was, by all available evidence, a fundamentally happy child living in conditions that her older sister would never have experienced with anything approaching equanimity. Wren found this both comforting and obscurely maddening.
Not because she wished Petra to be unhappy. Because she had noticed that adaptability, the capacity to be all right with whatever circumstances you found yourself in, was not always what it appeared to be. Sometimes it was genuine resilience. Sometimes it was not knowing there was something to miss. She got up at 2 in the morning. She did this quietly, in the practiced way of someone who did not want to disturb the performative sleeping around her. She put on her jacket and went to the corridor. Cade was on the step at the far end. This did not surprise her. She had noticed, over 6 months of training together, that Cade's relationship with sleep was complicated by his relationship with whatever he kept under very tight internal control. And that when the internal control slipped, which it did in the hours when the body was supposed to be resting, he ended up somewhere elevated and north-facing. The corridor step was the closest available approximation in a building that did not have roof access she'd found yet. She sat beside him. "Bad night?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "What would a good one look like?" This was one of his sentences that sounded like a deflection, and wasn't. She had learned this about him over months, that he said things that seemed to be closing conversations that were actually opening them. The trick was not to treat them as closures. "I've been thinking about Petra," she said, "your sister." "She doesn't know what she doesn't know. About before, about everything." She looked at the dark square of the exit door at the end of the corridor. The light above it read, "I go out there tomorrow, and I'm walking into a world I was taught doesn't exist anymore." And she's asleep at home thinking everything is fine because she doesn't know enough to think otherwise. Is that bad? I don't know. She considered it honestly. I think I'm glad she doesn't know. I think I'm also... She paused. I think there's something I'm afraid of. Not the mission, not the zombies. She turned it over. Afraid that what I find out there is going to be something I can't unknow. And then I'll have to decide what to do with it. Cade looked at her. "What do you think is out there?" she asked. "What's left," he said, "of whatever came through the iron wall? Ruins and the things that made ruins. That's all. That's enough." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you ever think you might be wrong?" The question sat between them. He didn't answer immediately, which was how she knew he was actually considering it rather than dismissing it. "I think," he said slowly, "that if I let myself think I might be wrong, I lose the thing that keeps me going." "And that's the most important thing? Keeping going?" "Right now, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My dad used to say that the most dangerous thing wasn't ignorance. It was certainty that protected you from information." "Your dad sounds exhausting," Cade said. She laughed. Full and warm and real, with no performance in it. The kind of laugh that the corridor wall absorbed and gave back softened. "He is," she said, "completely exhausting. I miss him every day." He looked at her. The expression on his face was one of the undefended ones, the kind that appeared when he forgot to maintain the particular blankness he generally carried. She'd seen it happen maybe 4 times before. She filed it carefully and made no comment. "Tell me something you want," she said. "What?" "After all of this, after whatever happens out there, something you actually want." She pulled her knees up. Something small even, a specific thing. He was quiet for a long time. "I want to understand why," he said. "Why what? Why any of this? Why the wall came down? Why those things exist? Why we're here and they're out there?" He paused. "I want the thing to make sense." "That's not small." "I know, you said something, I said something." She smiled. "Okay." She thought about her own answer. "I want to eat something that nobody rationed, something that just existed, because someone made it for the pleasure of making it." She paused. "My mom's bread, the specific bread, not because of what it represents, just because it was good bread." He looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, out at the red light above the exit. They sat there for another hour. She had gotten the corn muffins the previous evening. She would not say where. The supply warehouse had a particular loose panel near the south wall that she had identified in the first week.
that she had investigated in the second week when she was working the late kitchen shift and the supervision was minimal, and that she had determined was accessible in the small hours when the night guard was occupied with the refuge check at the outer compound. She had taken 2 muffins, precisely 2, wrapped them in her spare socks because she hadn't thought to bring anything better, and kept them through the night. She gave one to Cade in the yard before the assembly. He held it for a moment like he wasn't sure what it was. "It's food," she said. "Eat it." He ate it. The surprise on his face when he tasted it was real, not dramatic, just the brief widening that genuine unexpected pleasure produced, before the habitual control closed back over it. "Good," he said. "I know." She ate hers. The muffin was slightly compressed from being in a sock, and it was the best thing she'd eaten in weeks, and she ate it in 4 bites standing in the training compound yard while the rest of Class 104 assembled around them. And she thought, whatever happens today, I had a good muffin this morning. That's real. That happened. She thought about Petra. She thought, I'm going to come back. I'm going to tell her there's got to be better bread somewhere. I'm going to find it for her. She didn't know yet that this was exactly the quality, the small specific, stubborn insistence on the good things, the refusal to be entirely subsumed by the large bad ones that she would be best remembered for. The field debrief, after the mission, was scheduled for the evening. But something happened between the 5th mission and the debrief that changed the shape of what was being debriefed. In the 4th week of field operations, Wren and Cade had drawn the same patrol assignment for the Eastern Sector reconnaissance. 3 hours of moving through the ruins of the city's outer residential ring, cataloging structural changes and zombie concentration patterns. Standard procedure. The kind of mission that the class ran repeatedly until it became rote, building the muscle memory of operating outside. It was on this assignment that she learned the thing she hadn't known before, about what it was like to walk through a place that had been alive and was not anymore. She had known intellectually that Iron Gate was a real city, that real people had lived there, that the evacuation had left their lives mid-sentence. She had not previously processed it at the scale of walking through it. There was a school. She knew it was a school because the painted letters were still visible on the wall above the doorway, faded and weather-damaged, but readable. Iron Gate, East Primary, East, 2019. Inside, through the window, rows of small desks still in formation, as if waiting for a class that had stepped out for recess and not come back. Textbooks, a chalkboard with a math problem half completed. A child's drawing pinned to the bulletin board, a house with a smoke curl from the chimney, and a yellow sun and 2 stick figures holding hands. She stood outside the window and looked at the drawing for a long time. Behind her, Cade's footsteps stopped. She didn't turn around. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the drawing. The stick figures had been drawn in crayon, blue for one, red for the other. Someone's understanding of what mattered. A house, a son, 2 people together. "How old do you think?" she asked. "6, he said. "Maybe 7. She nodded. She thought about Petra, about the world Petra lived in, which had been made by the same event that had emptied this classroom, which Petra experienced as simply the world because she was too young to remember the before. She thought about how Petra would draw a house, whether she would draw a sun, whether the suns in children's drawings were a universal thing or a thing specific to a time when sun meant warmth and safety rather than just a feature of the environment. She thought, the child who drew this is somewhere, in Copper Wall probably, alive and grown, doing the labor assignments and eating the ration bread and maybe, on some evenings, remembering a classroom they had left behind mid-recess and not thinking too hard about what that meant. She thought, I am going to know what is on the other side of these walls. I am going to know it, and it is going to be real information, and I am going to do something with it that matters. She turned and walked on. Cade walked beside her. Chapter 5. The First Fight. The morning of the first mission, Sawyer Vex stood in front of the assembled class and said 3 sentences. We're going 12 kilometers east. We're cataloging. We're coming back. He didn't say, this is where you find out who you are when you're outside. He didn't say, "Remember your training. It's the only thing that's going to matter." He didn't say anything that acknowledged the particular quality of the air in the yard, the way 35 people were all breathing slightly differently than they had on any previous morning. He walked to the head of the column, and they followed. The gate into the old outer zone was a reinforced checkpoint in the eastern face of Copper Wall, not the main gates which were reserved for supply convoys and administrative movement, but a scout access point, narrow, heavily monitored, operated by a pair of guards who processed the class with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this 100 times and had long since stopped finding it remarkable that young people walked through this door on their way to places most of the population would not go. Cade went through fourth in line. On the other side, he stopped. Raven came through behind him and stopped beside him. Neither of them spoke. Elliot came through and stood a little to the left and looked at the horizon with the expression of someone checking a model against observed data. The world on the other side of the gate was not dramatic. It was not ash and ruin and cinematic desolation. It was, in the immediate vicinity of the wall, a cleared zone that had been maintained by scout perimeter work, trimmed back vegetation, visible sightlines, the practical tidiness of a security buffer. Beyond that, where the maintenance didn't reach, the world was doing what the world did when nobody was paying attention to it. The old suburban roads that had connected Irongate to the outer districts had cracked and settled and grown over. Grass came up through the pavement in long, vertical lines along the fissures. Small trees, volunteers, the ecological term for plants that had seeded themselves without human intention, stood in what had been yards and parking lots, already waist-high in some places, chest-high in others. It looked like 5 years of no one being here, which was exactly what it was. "Let's go," Vex said. And they went. The first zombie he killed was a man in a plaid shirt, or had been. The plaid shirt was the most human thing about it. Everything else had long since departed from any category that the word man could usefully contain. It was standing in what had been a side yard, motionless in the way of zombies, not currently tracking anything, head tilted slightly, facing a direction that had no apparent significance. Standard behavior. Isolated, non-threatening in its current state. Vex signaled the closest pair, which was Cade and Wren. They moved the way they had been drilled, Cade from the left, Wren from the right, closing the angle, reducing the reaction window. The zombie registered their approach at approximately 10 meters, turned, oriented, made the sound, and by the time it had done those things, Cade was inside its reach. He used the knife. His training handled the mechanics. His body did what his body had been trained to do. The zombie fell. Cade stood and looked at what was on the ground, and his training was not in charge anymore. The plaid shirt. Brown, white, the pattern still faintly visible under the damage and the years. Someone had bought this shirt in a store. Someone had worn it for years. Someone had been in it when whatever happened to this person happened to them. And now it was on the ground, and the person it had belonged to was not a person anymore, had not been for some time. And Cade had been the agent of its cessation. He had wanted this for 5 years. It did not feel like he had expected it to feel. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel release. He felt the specific hollowness of an action that had been rehearsed so many times in imagination that the real version couldn't match it. The itch scratched at last, finding not resolution, but the absence of the itch, which was not the same thing as satisfaction. Wren was beside him. She had killed her own a few meters away, and she was looking at her hands in the way Cade was looking at his own hands, and when she looked up at him, her expression said that she was having a version of the same experience. "Not like you thought?" she said. "No. Is that—" She hesitated. "Is that okay? That it's not like you thought?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded. She looked at the horizon. "Me either," she said. "I think that might be fine." They moved through the sector for 4 hours. What Elliot had theorized about the zombies' capacity for coordination became observable fact in the second hour, when the sounds started. Cade heard it first. not because he had better hearing, but because he had been listening for something wrong since they left the gate.
The ambient sounds of the sector were wind in the overgrown grass, occasional bird calls. The birds had returned, or some of them had. Nothing had told them they shouldn't. The footsteps of 35 trained people trying to move quietly,
The occasional structural sound from a building settling in ways that buildings settled when they were aging without maintenance. Within those sounds, overlaid on them, 3 short calls, a pause, 2 long ones. He stopped. Elliot was 2 positions behind him. Cade caught his eye and held up a fist. Elliot stopped. The people near them stopped. The signal rippled back. In the silence, everyone heard it. 3 short, a pause, 2 long. From the east, an answer, different pitch, same rhythm. Elliot's face did the thing it did when a model he had built matched observed data. Not triumphant, just a settling, a small alignment of things falling into place. He looked at Cade, and his expression said, "I told you so, but without satisfaction, because being right about this was not a thing to take satisfaction in." Vex was beside them in seconds. He stood and listened with the practiced stillness of someone who had heard this before, and had formed a view about what it meant. "Pattern repeat?" he asked, very low. "At least 3 distinct sources," Elliot said, equally low. "The Western response is new. It wasn't in the first cycle." Vex processed this. His eyes moved through the visible terrain without urgency but with absolute attention. "Covering pattern," he said, not to them specifically. To himself, he was reading the situation. "They're triangulating," Elliot said. "Yes." Vex raised his hand and made the signal for fall back, maintain formation. "We do this in order. No acceleration. Move!" They moved. The withdrawal took 40 minutes that felt longer. They moved in formation, Vex at the rear, Raven and 2 others working the flanks. The class maintaining a discipline that had been trained into them over months and that was being accessed now in the way that training was meant to be accessed. Not thinking about it, just doing it, the body acting while the mind was occupied with the actual problem. The signals continued around them. They changed as the class moved. The pattern adjusted, the positions of the sources shifting in ways that tracked the movement of the group. Whatever was producing those signals was mapping them. They came through the gate in the same formation they'd left in. The gate sealed behind them. For a moment, nobody spoke. 35 people stood in the cleared buffer zone inside Copper Wall's outer perimeter and looked at each other, or at the ground, or at the gate. And the silence had in it all of the things that couldn't be said in a debrief. Then Ren said very quietly, quietly, and someone laughed, not from humor, from the release of the word having been said. And then they were moving again, back to the compound, back to the order of things. But Cade was not thinking about the mission. He was thinking about the signals, about the pattern, about what Elliot had said. The question is, who is giving the orders? He was thinking about Elliot's map. He was thinking about the thing he had told Ren. "I want to understand why." For the first time, standing just inside the wall of a city that was supposed to be protecting him from a dead world, he was beginning to suspect that the dead world was not what they'd been told it was. He didn't say this. Not yet. He filed into the compound and went to the debrief and said what he had observed and answered what was asked, and looked at Elliot across the room and saw in Elliot's face the expression of someone who was writing this all down, adding it to the map, revising the model. Tomorrow they would go out again. Whatever was out there, they were going to understand it. Chapter 6. What Walked Out of the Dark. The 5th engagement was the one where Cade disappeared, not metaphorically. They were working the western edge of the old industrial district, a sector with dense structural cover, sightlines compromised by the remains of warehouse walls and loading bays. The kind of terrain that the scout manuals listed in the high difficulty column for precisely the reasons that were now manifesting. The zombie concentration was higher than the preliminary survey had indicated. The preliminary survey had been conducted 4 weeks prior, and 4 weeks was long enough for a concentration to shift. Cade was working with a three-person team, himself and two classmates named Brecken and Osei, with Raven covering a parallel line 40 meters to the north. Standard formation for this terrain type. They were moving through a loading bay when the anomaly appeared. It was larger than anything they'd encountered. Not giant, not the size that the histories described for the catastrophic events, but large, 6.5 feet at least, with the specific dense quality of a body that had changed in ways beyond the standard deterioration. Its movement was different, deliberate, not the random vectoring of a disoriented organism. It was oriented toward Cade specifically. Later, Cade would reconstruct what had happened in the subsequent seconds with the imperfect accuracy of someone reconstructing an event they did not fully witness because they were inside it. The anomaly had moved faster than its size suggested. It had closed the distance between them before his response time could match. And then there was the crowd of standard-class zombies that had been moving through the loading bay on the south side, a group he had already assessed and logged as manageable, which became relevant when the anomaly drove him into them. After that, his memory stopped. Raven heard him for approximately 3 seconds after contact. His voice, a word, possibly two, and then the ambient noise of the engagement swallowed it, and she heard nothing. She finished her section. She came to his position. He was not there. She looked at the ground. She looked at the loading bay. She looked at the positions of Brecken and Osei, who were waiting at the extraction point and who did not know where he was either. She went back in. She went in alone, which was against protocol, and she understood that it was against protocol, and she went in anyway because the other option was to stand at the extraction point and not know, and she had discovered something about herself in the months of training that she had not previously understood. She could endure difficulty, danger, discomfort, loss in most forms. What she could not endure was passivity in the face of uncertainty about a specific person. She searched for him for 4 hours. She went through the loading bay and the adjacent warehouse sections and the network of service corridors behind them. She went floor by floor in 3 buildings. She found evidence of him, a section of wall that had been hit with the impact pattern of someone being driven against it hard, a smear of blood on a support beam at hip height, but not him. She went back through the loading bay twice. She called his name at the volume she'd calculated as audible to a person without being audible to the things she needed not to attract. No answer. At approximately 2 in the morning, Sawyer Vex appeared beside her in the way he sometimes appeared, without noise, without announcement, in a narrow corridor between 2 collapsed shelving units, and he said quietly and without particular inflection, "Come in." She stood still. "We'll extend the search at first light with full team protocol," he said. "The way you're doing it right now is how you become the second person we're looking for." "Punti." She knew he was right. This was the specific torture of correct reasoning. It was still correct when it was also unbearable. She came in. Dawn came at 5:47. She was sitting on the front step of the compound's east entrance, having spent approximately 40 minutes doing what she did not do often, which was nothing. She had sat on the step and been still and breathed, and not let herself think too much about what the specific ways one stopped being retrievable looked like. At 5:51, she heard footsteps. One person, from the direction of the industrial sector. Steady, not running. She stood. He came out of the morning fog along the access road, and the first thing she registered was that he was walking normally, not the gait of someone injured past function, not the stumbling of someone in shock. Walking, upright, at a pace that was almost deliberate. His clothes were in a state that would have described an extremely violent experience. The jacket was functionally gone from the left shoulder down, the sleeve in pieces. His forearms and hands were covered in something that had dried overnight to a dark uniform color. There was a wound on his right arm that had clotted and was in the process of scabbing. His face was marked with the same dried darkness, less densely, and under it he looked entirely himself. Not wild, not dissociated, not the face of someone who had been somewhere that had changed them at a cellular level. She looked at that face, and her chest did something she did not have a productive word for. She looked at the ground around him. In a rough radius of 50 to 60 feet, the loading bay's overflow area was littered with bodies. She counted approximately 40 to 50 of them. She stopped counting. They were very thoroughly ceased. She looked at his hands. He was looking at his hands too. This moment, the two of them, standing in the early light and fog, both looking at his hands, neither of them yet having spoken. This was the moment Cade would remember. When he tried to describe what it felt like to understand that he was not what he had previously assumed himself to be. Not the memory he had of the event itself, which was absent. Not the medical assessment that would come later. This moment, specifically, his hands in the growing light, the dried evidence on them, Raven standing still and looking. "You don't remember," she said. Not a question. "No. Any of it?" "I remember being hit." He turned his hands over, turned them back, the gesture of someone checking that the thing they are examining is real. Then this. She was quiet for a moment. Whatever she was feeling, she was managing it, which was one of the things she did that he respected and that sometimes made her difficult to read. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He moved his arms, rotated his shoulders, pressed the wound on his right arm until he felt the edge of what it was willing to tolerate. "Functionally, no. We need to tell Vex." "I know." She looked at him for another moment. The expression on her face was one of the ones he'd learned to recognize as significant, even when nothing in it was legible from the outside. "Don't do that again," she said. "Do what?" "Disappear." Her voice was completely level. This was not the same as emotion being absent. "Don't disappear." He looked at her. The full morning light was coming up now, beginning to clear the fog, and in it he could see the thing she wasn't saying. The particular strain of a person who had spent the night in a state they were not going to describe, out of some combination of privacy and the fact that describing it would require acknowledging its dimensions. "I'll try," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and said, "Come on. Vex needs the report." She turned and walked toward the compound entrance. He followed. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The specific quality of the air between them, the proximity of two people who had just confirmed something about the particular importance of the other's continued existence, was communication enough. Chapter 7. The Tribunal. The summons came. 3 days later, Cade had known it was coming. The transformation, which was what Vex called it in his report, carefully, using a word that described the observable without committing to an interpretation, had been documented. Brecken and Osei had filed their accounts. The physical evidence from the site had been assessed by the compound's medical and technical staff, who had produced a report that used careful language to say, in essence, "We don't fully understand what happened, but we know it was him." The Wall Council had read the report. The Wall Council had views. The tribunal room was in the administrative annex on the second floor of the northern compound building, a room that had clearly been designed for purposes of authority, with the high table at one end and the single chair for the subject at the other, and the acoustic qualities of a room where sound traveled in one direction. Cade sat in the single chair and looked at the 7 people at the high table, and did not feel, as perhaps he was meant to feel, small. He felt very clearly located, which was not the same thing. Elliot was to his right. He had brought, without being asked, a document he had spent 2 nights producing. 40 pages of what he called analysis, what the 7 people at the table would call an argument, covering the observable evidence for and against every interpretation of Cade's transformation that current understanding permitted. He held it the way he held things he was prepared to deploy precisely at the correct moment. The council read the charges with the tone of people who had already decided and were conducting the formality. Elliot began to speak. Cade listened to him speak and watched the 7 people behind the table and thought about what Vex had said about reason versus purpose. He thought about the conversation on the roof before Class 104 began. He thought about what he had come here to do, and whether what was currently happening to him, the ability, whatever it was, whatever it meant, was something that helped with that or changed it or neither. The 7 people listened to Elliot with the listening quality of people who were waiting for him to finish. The head of the council opened his mouth to address the table. The door opened. Sawyer Vex moved through the room with the particular economy of someone who had decided what they were doing before they started doing it and was not revising in motion. He went to the secondary table on the room's left side, the table that held the water pitcher and the spare forms and the minor equipment of proceedings. And he set his knife on it, not aggressively, not with performance. He set it down the way you set a thing down when you want it visible, a fact, stated without inflection. The room looked at the knife. The room looked at Vex. "He's mine," Vex said. He used the possessive the way a unit commander used it, which was not ownership but affiliation. Not I own this person, but this person belongs to the structure I am responsible for. And that structure has a view about what happens to its people. The head of the council said, "Commander Vex, the review procedure requires—" "I know what it requires," Vex said, still without raising his voice, still with the same complete absence of urgency. "I'm telling you where the line is." The head of the council looked at the knife. He looked at the file in front of him. He looked at the 6 people beside him. He cleared his throat. "We will reconvene this assessment under extended review protocol," he said. "The subject will be released pending—" "Good," Vex said. He picked up the knife and walked out. They released Cade 2 hours later, after the form had been filed and the extended review protocol had been initiated, which Elliot told him on the way out would take somewhere between 6 and 18 months to produce a result, and which Elliot also told him was, in practical terms, the council's way of managing something they didn't know what to do with by putting it in a box marked to be revisited. "Will they revisit it?" Cade asked. "Probably not," Elliot said. "Not if we give them no reason to." He paused. "And not if Vex keeps caring." "Why does he?" Elliot thought about this. "I think because he understands something about what you are that they don't," he said. "I think he saw it the first day." Cade sat on the step outside the tribunal room. The afternoon light was slanted and warm on the annex's stone wall. From somewhere in the compound he could hear the sounds of the afternoon drill session. The rhythm of bodies in motion, the occasional command, the consistent background sounds of people being trained. "Elliot," he said. "Yes." "What do you think I am?" Elliot sat beside him. He took the map out of his jacket and looked at it, which was what he did when he was thinking, rather than when he had already thought. He turned it over, blank side up, and looked at the blankness. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are something that the framework we've been given isn't adequate to describe." He paused. "I think that's also true of a lot of other things. I think the framework they've given us is wrong in ways we haven't finished discovering yet." He folded the map back. "I don't know what you are specifically. But I don't think the categories available, zombie, human, threat, asset, I don't think any of them are exactly right." "So, what do I do?" "What you were already doing," Elliot said. "Go out. Look at things. Try to understand." He paused. "And don't give the council a reason to revisit their box." Cade looked at the afternoon light on the wall. "Okay," he said. Chapter 8. Lyra. They caught Lyra Steele in the 7th week of field operations, which was the week that Cade had begun to understand that most of the things he had assumed about the nature of what was outside the walls were inadequate. The mission was a tracking assignment in the eastern residential ruins, the kind of zone that had been a middle-class neighborhood before the collapse. Row houses and small yards and the particular density of domestic life from 40 years ago still visible in the shapes of things even after 5 years of vacancy. They were following a movement signature that the advanced reconnaissance team had flagged as anomalous, a single entity, small, highly mobile, using structures for cover in ways that implied premeditation. The advanced team had said, probably a high-functioning variant, possibly adaptive approach with non-standard protocols. Vex had said nothing, which was its own kind of instruction.
The entity led them for 3 hours. This was the first anomaly, apparent in retrospect. A zombie that fled rather than engaged. The basic behavior profile for zombies, the hardwired orientation toward fresh organic material,
did not include flight. A zombie that fled was not, in the strict behavioral sense of the word, behaving like a zombie. But they were still treating it as such when it led Cade through a gap in a collapsed retaining wall into a narrow service passage between 2 row houses and the gap sealed behind him. Not literally. The wall didn't close, but the tactical geometry of the situation shifted suddenly and completely. He was in a confined space, the exit was behind him, and the thing he had been pursuing was in front of him, standing still, no longer fleeing. Facing him, it was Lyra Steele. She was wearing the same scout field jacket she'd worn on every mission. Her knife was in her hand, held loosely, at an angle that was not offensive and was not passive, the angle of someone who hadn't decided yet. She looked at him with an expression that he had never seen on her face before, which was significant, because she had spent months not showing expression on her face, and what she was showing now was resignation. The resignation of someone who has been running a calculation for a long time and has arrived at the result they already suspected. "You," he said. "Me," she said. He raised his weapon. She didn't move. "How long?" he asked. "Since before the class started," she said. "I was placed. That's the word they use." She said they, with a particular weight that he noted and filed without yet having the context to unpack. "I was placed to monitor the training cohort, report on capabilities." She paused. "Specifically on yours. Mine, so the transformation ability. They knew about you before you did." She looked at him steadily. "Or before you were aware you knew." He felt the weight of something shifting behind what he could see. A landscape of implications that extended beyond this service passage. But this was not the time. "Who is they?" he asked. She shook her head, not refusing, just indicating limits. "I can't tell you everything now. What I can tell you is, don't believe the story they've been telling you." She paused. "Any of the stories." "What does that mean?" "It means what it means." She looked at him steadily. "When you understand it, you'll understand it. Until then..." She lowered the knife all the way, held both hands open and out. "Take me in," she said. "I'm not going to fight you." Ikar looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him with the patience of someone who had already accounted for this moment and had said what she needed to say. He took her in. They put her in the containment unit 10 days later. The unit was a development from the technical division, glass and ceramic and particular metallic compounds designed on theoretical principles derived from what was understood about the transformation mechanism. Nobody had tested it before. The theory was that it would suppress the capability while leaving consciousness and function intact. In practice, it worked. She was in it, and she was aware, and she could see out and they could see in. An existence that was not imprisonment and was not freedom that the compound's administrative language described as protective custody pending assessment, which was a way of saying that nobody knew what to do with her either. Cade came to see her the day before the unit was sealed. She looked at him through the glass. That wasn't glass, with the expression she had in the service passage. Resigned, present, decided. "Is there anything you want to say?" he asked. She considered. "When you find out what's actually going on," she said, "remember that the choice isn't only between their way and his way." "Whose way?" She looked at him. "You'll know," she said, "when the time comes." He stood at the glass for another minute. "I'm sorry," he said. He wasn't entirely sure what he was sorry for, but it was true. She shook her head slightly, not declining the apology. More like declining the premise, as if this was not a situation that required it. "Be careful," she said. "Not with your life, with your conclusions." The unit sealed the following morning. Her eyes stayed open. Chapter 9, The Day. Dex and Colt told the truth. 23 kilometers east of Copper Wall in the third week of winter operations, the class went further than it had gone before. Nobody explained why. The orders came through the chain, and Vex relayed them with the same tone he used for any orders, which was the tone of a person for whom the origin of an instruction was less relevant than its content. They were going into the deep sector. They were doing a structural survey. They were taking an extended kit, 4-day supplies, heavy weather gear, the communications equipment that the class had been trained on but had never had occasion to use at range. The first night, they sheltered in an old church. It had been a Gothic revival design, the kind built in the early 20th century in medium-sized American cities by congregations who wanted permanence and had the resources to gesture toward it. The roof had mostly surrendered to gravity and weather over the years, but the walls stood with the confidence of things built to outlast their purpose. The stained glass was entirely gone from the frames, which now held only the geometric shapes of the empty space. On clear nights, which this was, the light came through those shapes and landed on the stone floor in forms that were almost decorative. Cade set his bedroll in the north transept, which was the most intact section. Dex Harlow came and sat on the stone step of the side entrance a few feet away. For a while they sat in the near dark, the sounds of the class settling for the night around them, the occasional distant noise from outside that might have been weather and might not have been. "Can't sleep?" Cade asked. "Not yet." Dex looked at the entrance arch, the frame of empty darkness where a door had been. "You?" "Thinking." "About what?" Cade looked at the shapes of light on the floor. "About whether what we've been told is the right set of facts." Dex was quiet. "Elliot has a theory," Cade said. "He thinks the things outside the walls are coordinated in ways that imply something, a source of coordination, something we haven't been shown." He paused. "I think he's right." Dex's hands, he noticed, were resting very still on his knees. "The signals," Dex said. Not exactly confirming, not exactly denying. "The signals," Cade said. "The movement patterns, the way they don't seem to be what we were told they were." Another long pause. "Cade," Dex said. "Something in the way," he said the name, with a weight that didn't match the casualness of the conversation, made Cade turn and look at him directly. Dex was looking at the floor. His hands on his knees hadn't moved. His face had the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had reached the point where the carrying was heavier than the alternative. "There are things I should have told you," he said, "that I didn't, because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear them, and because I wasn't sure I was ready to say them." He paused. "I'm not sure the second part has changed." "Say them anyway," Cade said. Dex looked at him. His eyes, in the stone and starlight of the old transept, were tired in a way that was not about sleep. "Tomorrow," he said. "Something will happen tomorrow, and when it does, I need you to remember that I'm telling you this now. We didn't choose it. Everything that was done before and during, we were following orders we were given before we were old enough to understand what we were agreeing to. And we have been trying, in the ways available to us, to cause less harm than we were sent here to cause." He stopped. "I know that doesn't make it right. I know that's not enough. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to hold it alongside the rest of it when you're deciding what things mean." Cade looked at him. In the long silence, the light shapes on the floor moved slowly as the stars tracked overhead. "What are you?" he asked. Dex looked at the floor. "Something you'll understand more tomorrow," he said. He stood. "Sleep if you can. You'll need to be clear tomorrow." He moved to the south transept and set up his bedroll. Cade sat with the light shapes for a long time. The ambush came at noon. They were moving through what the maps called the Claybrook district, the remains of a light industrial area that had been in the process of being converted to residential when the collapse had ended the conversion, leaving behind a mixture of warehouse shells and half-built apartment blocks and the particular architecture of transition. The class was spread across 3 parallel teams, a standard configuration for urban search pattern, moving in coordinated advances with time check-ins. The first shots came from the east,
High ground. Someone in the upper floors of a building that should have been empty and was not. The impact pattern was controlled, not panicked. 2 rounds, pause, 2 rounds, pause. The pattern of someone who knew what they were doing and was positioning rather than suppressing.
The class broke into cover with the training taking over. The voices, the signals, the organized chaos of a group that had rehearsed this. But it wasn't zombies. The shooters were people. Cade knew this from the weapon sounds, not the organic, non-directional sounds that the things outside made, but the unmistakable mechanical sounds of specific manufactured arms. There were people in the buildings around them, with weapons positioned, and they were shooting at the scout class. He was behind a collapsed wall section with Ren and Elliot, Raven 3 positions north, Vex somewhere to the rear, when the shooting stopped. Not because they'd handled it, because something else happened. Dex Harlow walked out into the street. Cade watched him from behind the rubble. Dex walked out into the open center of the Claybrook intersection, with the measured pace of someone walking a known distance. He stopped at the center. He stood. And then he changed. Not quickly, not violently. Not the way that Cade's own transformation had happened, in crisis and without memory, deliberately, as if he wanted it seen. The armor came up, the layering and the hardening and the particular quality of the armored variant that the textbooks described and the scouts were trained to handle, and that was standing 40 feet away in the body of the man who had held doors open for his classmates. Colt Fenn stepped out from the other side and changed too. The Colossus, the shape that had been Colt Fenn filling half the sky above Claybrook, the street suddenly small around him, the buildings on either side suddenly contextual. Cade had seen images. The images had not prepared him for the sound of it, the way the air moved differently when something that large occupied space in the world. The shooting from the buildings stopped. Complete silence in the Claybrook district. Cade did not move. He held the rubble wall, and he looked at Dex in the street, and he held 2 thoughts simultaneously that could not be held simultaneously, but were, "This is the thing that destroyed the iron wall and killed my mother," and "This is Dex Harlow, who held the door, who asked if I was okay outside a dark church." The armored figure moved toward his position. It covered the 40 feet slowly. It stopped at the rubble wall, and it looked down, and Cade looked up, and in the face that was not Dex's face and also was Dex's face, there were the eyes, still exactly Dex's eyes, the tiredness, the thing he had seen the night before in the transept light. "We didn't want this," Dex said. The voice came from a body not built for it, and was still clearly Dex. Cade couldn't speak. "We didn't want this," Dex said again, evenly, without urgency, as if this were not an armored giant in a dead city, but a man sitting on a church step, telling a truth he'd been holding for a long time. Then he turned, and Colt turned, and they walked east down the Claybrook street until they were gone. Ren died 2 hours before they reached the gate. The engagement at Claybrook had been resolved. The shooters had withdrawn when Dex and Colt moved east. The class had regrouped and assessed casualties, none, and extracted by the most direct route. They were moving through the outer residential zone, a strip of old suburb between the industrial area and the wall buffer, the light going flat and gray in the late afternoon, when a single shot came from a building on the north side of the road. The shooter was a holdout from the Claybrook group, left behind or separated, operating with the kind of reduced judgment that a person operating alone in deteriorating circumstances tended toward. One shot, not well placed, fired into the moving group from a third-floor window. Cade was on Ren's left. He was a step ahead of her slightly, which was why what happened happened to her and not to him, which was a fact that he would live with for the rest of his life without ever finding a way to think about it that didn't cost something. She went down without sound. He turned, and he caught her before she hit the ground, not from instinct, from proximity, from the automatic response of his hands to the body beside him falling. And he had her. He was down on one knee with her in his arms, and her eyes were open. She looked up at the sky. The sky was gray. There was nothing particular to look at. She breathed, differently. She looked at the sky with the directness she looked at most things with, as if even this was worth seeing clearly. She breathed once more. Then she didn't. They carried her the rest of the way. This was not in the protocol, but it was not questioned. Sawyer Vex didn't order it and didn't countermand it. Brecken and Osai made a carry with their arms, and they took her through the buffer zone and through the gate and into Copper Wall because she was theirs, and the idea of leaving her in the outer zone was not an idea that anyone in the class was willing to hold. Raven came to Cade in the receiving area, and she stood beside him, and she didn't say anything, which was right, which was what was needed. Elliot stood on his other side and looked at the ground. The burial was in a cleared plot at the edge of the outer residential zone, against the wall. Cade dug. He dug until the hole was right, and then he kept digging, and Raven eventually took the second entrenching tool without saying anything, and dug beside him, and eventually the hole was more than right, and Raven said quietly, "That's enough," and he stopped. The rain came while they were filling it back in. Light. The kind of rain that wasn't committing to being rain yet, just suggesting it, the air more wet than dry, and the sky the same flat gray it had been when she looked up at it. When it was done, Cade stood with his hands at his sides, the entrenching tool on the ground, and looked at the turned earth. He thought about what she had asked him on the roof in the third month. "Do you ever think about after?" He thought about what he had said. "I want to understand why." He thought about what she had said, "I want bread that somebody made just because they wanted to." He thought about the corn muffin, the specific pleasure she had taken in it, the grin, wide, complete, directed at whoever was there to share it with. He thought about the classroom with the small desks and the half-finished math problem and the crayon drawing pinned to the board. He thought about the child who drew it, about Petra, about the things that didn't get explained until they were over. He didn't understand yet that what he was feeling was not only grief, that something else was also present, something that had been building through the month, through Elliot's map and the signals in the outer zone and Lyra's words and Dex's eyes in the transept light, something that did not have a simple name. He thought, "There is more to this than I have been told." He thought, "I am going to find out what it is." He thought, "I am coming for it, whatever it is, and I am not going to stop." He picked up the entrenching tool. Raven walked beside him toward the gate. The rain was fully committing now, behind them in the turning soil, the beginning of what he would spend the rest of his life trying to finish. That night in the barracks, nobody slept. The map was on the floor between Cade and Elliot, spread flat. The pencil marks dense in some sections and sparse in others. The northern boundary still provisional, still being revised. Raven sat with her back against the wall and her eyes at a middle distance that meant she was inside her own thoughts. "She knew something," Cade said. "Lyra?" Elliot asked. "Dex. Before it happened. The night before. He told me something was coming." He looked at the map. He knew what he was. He's known the whole time. Elliot was quiet, which meant he was agreeing. "The signals," Cade said. "The coordination. The fact that Dex and Colt have been inside the walls this whole time, in this class, doing what they were doing. The fact that they—" He stopped. "They could have killed everyone and they didn't. What does that mean?" "It means," Elliot said carefully, "that the categories are wrong. The categories we have, human, zombie, threat, target, they're not describing what's actually here." He looked at the map. "I've been trying to model the outside for 2 years. And I think the model I've been building is wrong at its foundation, because I've been taking as given that the outside is what they say it is." He paused. "I don't think it is." "Then what is it?" Elliot turned the map over. Blank side up, the blankness of a space that had not yet been charted. "Something else," he said. "Something we don't have the information to describe yet." He put his pencil down. "But we're going to." The rain on the barracks roof. The absence of the voice that should have been saying something about bread, about wind, about what came after. Cade looked at the blank side of the map. He thought, yes, whatever it is, we are going to. End of part 1. Iron. Interlude. What Elliot's map said. 3 days after Wren's burial, Elliot laid the map flat on the pine table in their room in Block C and told Cade and Raven what he believed. He had been building toward this for a long time.
The map was not just a map anymore. It was an argument, a cumulative case assembled from fragments, scout patrol data, atmospheric observations, zombie movement patterns, the architectural evidence of the ruins, the specific behavior of the variants they had encountered. Each piece alone was inconclusive. Together, Elliot believed, they pointed somewhere. The world outside the walls is not empty, he said. He said it the way he said most true things, not dramatically, not with the weight of announcement, just with the clarity of someone placing a fact on the table for examination. He put his pencil down and looked at them. "You don't know that," Raven said. "I believe it. There's a difference." He turned the map over. On the back, he had been writing notes for the past several weeks, densely, small, filling the margins with the overflow of a model that was bigger than its container. "Look at the movement patterns. The zombies in the outer zone don't behave like organisms without coordination. They behave like organisms responding to instructions. The signals, we've documented those now. Someone is giving orders." "Something," Cade said. "Someone," Elliot said. "The distinction matters." He pointed to a cluster of markings on the map's northern edge. The advance team for the winter operations logged a patrol route that went 60 kilometers north. They didn't go further because of the orders, but the terrain they described is not the terrain of a dead world. Soil profiles consistent with active agriculture, structural evidence in the ruins that suggests selective demolition rather than collapse. Some buildings are gone in ways that look chosen, not random. He paused. The world didn't end. Something happened to it. Those are different things. Cade sat with this. "The zombies," Raven said.
"The ones out there. If someone is coordinating them, then they're a weapon," Elliot said. "Or a tool, or both. Whose weapon? That's the question." The rain that had started the night of Wren's burial had continued for 3 days. It came against the window at an angle, and in the room's quiet, the sound of it was like static, like a broadcast that couldn't quite resolve into a signal. My father was at the northern depot," Cade said. He hadn't said this aloud since the first week after the collapse. The words had a weight from disuse, from having been carried internally for 5 years. He was at the maintenance depot when the wall came down. He was directly in the path of what came through. Neither Elliot nor Raven spoke. "The report said unaccounted for," Cade continued. "Not dead. Not confirmed. Unaccounted for." He looked at the map. "If the world outside isn't what they said—" "I know," Elliot said, quietly. "Then the people who were unaccounted for—" "I know," Elliot said again. The same quietness. The quietness of someone who had already done this calculation and had not wanted to be the one to say it. Raven looked at Cade. Her expression was careful and clear. The expression of someone who was deciding how much honesty was useful and arriving, as she generally did, at all of it. "It might not mean anything good," she said. "Whatever is out there, the people who might still be out there." "I know that," Cade said. "I just want to say it before we start," she said. "Before whatever comes next. I want to say that I know we want to find things, and the things might not be findable, or they might be findable in ways that aren't." She stopped. "I know what I want when I imagine going out there. I also know the difference between wanting something and it being true." Cade looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. He looked at the map, at the blank northern edge where Elliot's knowledge gave out, at the notes in the margins that were building, piece by piece, toward a picture of a world that was not what they'd been told. "What do we do with this?" Pampulor asked. "We go through the training," Elliot said. "We qualify for extended operations. We get access to the outer sectors that Class 104 isn't cleared for yet. He paused. We find out. And if we find out something that... Cade tried to find the word. Something that changes everything. Elliot turned the map back to the drawn side. He looked at it for a long moment. Then we figure out what to do with everything that changed, he said. Outside, the rain continued. Somewhere in Block C, a child was singing to itself. One of the rhymes that children sang, repetitive and without particular meaning, the sounds of someone young and alive in a world that was, whatever else it was, still holding them. Cade picked up the pencil. He began adding to the blank northern edge of the map, not from knowledge, from intention. Marking the direction they were going to go. One small notation, and then another. Interlude. What Raven kept, in the drawer of the dresser in the Block C room, under Cade's extra clothes, there was a notebook. Raven had known about it since the first week after the collapse, when she had seen him tuck it under the clothes with the particular care of someone storing something they were not ready to deal with. She had never asked about it. She had never opened the drawer unless she was looking for her own things. She had organized her behavior around the notebook's presence with the specific respect one extended to a thing that was not yours to open. After the 5th year, she had begun to understand something about it. It was not that Cade couldn't open it. It was that opening it required him to believe, at some level, that the person who wrote it had something to say to him. And believing that required him to believe in a continuity between the father who left and the boy who was left and the young man now, that he had managed to avoid examining by keeping the notebook closed. She understood this because she recognized the structure. She had her own version of it. Her father's last patrol assignment had been a perimeter check on the eastern face of Iron Wall. He had gone out in the morning with 3 others. The 3 others had come back. He had not. The official record said lost in action during perimeter operations, which was accurate in the way that the minimum number of words needed to describe a thing was accurate, insufficient, and not required to ask or answer any questions. She had kept, from that time, one of his unit patches, the kind sewn onto the shoulder of the guard jacket. She had removed it after the evacuation from the spare jacket he had left in the closet before the closet's contents were redistributed. She kept it in her own jacket's inside pocket, where it made a very slight pressure against her ribs when she wore it. She had never told Cade about this. Not because it was a secret, because it was hers, and there was a difference between secret and private. And she had come to understand that the private things, the things you carried in your own hands without requiring anyone else to help you carry them, were not failures of openness. They were the parts of yourself that you kept whole by keeping them to yourself. She thought about this on the night of the 4th day after Wren, lying in her bunk in the barracks, listening to the rain. She thought about what Wren had been, in the specific texture of it. Not the grief of her absence, which was real and present and ongoing, but the thing Wren herself had been, the specific grain of her. The particular quality of someone who could find a second blanket from somewhere and share it without ceremony, who could eat a compressed corn muffin with complete, uncomplicated pleasure, who could ask, "What do you want after all of this?" and mean it as a real question, not a rhetorical one. She thought, I want to be able to answer that question. She thought, I want to be alive long enough to give it a real answer. She thought, there is something coming that I don't understand yet. I can feel the shape of it at the edges. Whatever it is, I need to be present for it. I need to not be dead before it arrives. She turned the unit patch over in her fingers in the dark. Her father had held a wall against something, had stood in the position he was in and held it, had in the end not held it, but had stood. She thought, I know how to do that. She thought, whatever is coming, I know how to stand. The rain on the barracks roof, the breathing of the class around her. She put the patch back in her pocket and closed her eyes. Interlude, the notebook. On the morning of the 6th day after Wren's burial, Cade opened the notebook. He didn't plan to. He was in the Block C room, which they'd been given leave to use for the week, looking for a pencil in the drawer, and his hand found the notebook, in the way that things you are not looking for present themselves when your attention is elsewhere. He stood at the drawer for a moment,
He took the notebook out. He sat at the pine table, the table with the old ring from coffee mugs and the scratch he'd made with a toy truck when he was 4, and he held it without opening it for a while. Then he opened it. His father wrote the way he had always written, the forward slanting script, the lowercase g, always in a hurry. The notebook was about 2/3 full. The first entry was dated 4 years before the collapse, which meant he had started it when Cade was 6. The last entry was dated the day before the iron wall came down. Cade did not read it in one sitting. He couldn't. He would read a section and have to stop and put it down and look at something else. The window, the table, the pencil stub that Elliot had left on the table's edge. And wait for the thing the words produced to settle enough that he could continue. His father had known things. This was the first fact that came through the entries. He had known things that he had not told Cade, had not told his mother, had possibly not told anyone. And the notebook was the place he had put them, not as confession, not with the shape of a man relieving himself of a burden, but with the shape of a man working through information he had been given and trying to build a complete picture. His father worked at the maintenance depot, which meant he had access to the sections of the wall infrastructure that most civilians never saw. This meant he had seen the things that maintenance workers saw, the composition of the wall's construction, the engineering decisions that had been made in building it, the specific ways it had been strengthened and in some places weakened over the years since the collapse. He had written all of this down, the practical and the speculative both, in the methodical way of someone who did not know exactly why they were collecting information, but suspected it would eventually become useful. And then, in the entries from the last 2 years before the collapse, something shifted. His father had encountered something. He did not say what, not directly. Chicot. The entries became oblique, in the way of someone who understood they were writing something that could be read by someone they hadn't intended and was being careful. But the shape of what he was describing was legible. He had learned something about the world outside the walls that did not match what he had been told. Something that suggested the maintenance depot's particular location and function was not coincidental. Something about the nature of the iron wall itself that went beyond its described purpose. He had started looking for something, a place he called the cellar. Cade read this 3 times before understanding that his father was not talking about any cellar he'd known growing up. He was talking about a place he'd found, or been told about, or been directed to. In the last entry, the night before the collapse, he had written, "I think I know where it is. I think it's been there the whole time. I'm going to go look tomorrow before my shift." The entry ended there. Tomorrow had been the day the wall came down. Cade sat at the table for a long time after he finished. He turned the notebook over in his hands. He set it on the table. He turned it face up. He read the last entry again. "I think I know where it is." He thought about Elliot's map, the blank northern edge, the notes in the margins building toward something. He thought about what Dex had said in the transept light. Don't believe the stories they've been telling you. Any of the stories. He thought about Lyra, in the glass, when you find out what's actually going on. He thought about what Vex had said months ago about reason versus purpose. He put the notebook in his jacket's inner pocket, where Raven kept her father's patch. He buttoned the pocket closed. He sat at the pine table and looked at the window and the light coming through it, the ordinary morning light of Copper Wall Block City, the world that was all most people here had ever known. He thought, there is a cellar somewhere. He thought, my father went looking for it and didn't come back. He thought, I am going to find it. End of part 1. Iron. Interlude. 6 things about Sawyer Vex. The recruits of Class 104 assembled 6 facts about Sawyer Vex in the months of training, piecing them together from observation and inference, and the occasional word from the older scouts who had known him longer. 1. He had been in the scouts since before the collapse.
This made him one of perhaps a dozen people in the Copper Wall command structure with pre-collapse operational experience, which was a category that commanded particular weight in a world where most institutional knowledge had been rebuilt from scratch after the evacuation. What the pre-collapse scouts had done, what had existed in the zone, outside the walls, in the years before the Iron Wall fell, was a subject on which the official record was thin and Vex himself was silent. 2. He had been married. This was inferred from a ring he didn't wear, and a habit, visible to people who spent enough time around him, of touching the third finger of his left hand when he thought he wasn't being observed. When Wren had asked him directly, she was the only one who would have, he had looked at her with an expression that was not quite anything, and had said, irrelevant to your training, which was not the same as a denial. 3. He did not give orders he hadn't already calculated the cost of. This was something the class understood collectively and wordlessly, the way a group of people in proximity to a consistent person understood things. He never asked them to do something he would not do himself. He never asked them to accept a cost he hadn't already accepted, in some version, for himself. The knife that he set on the table in the tribunal room. This was not an act of impulse. It was an act of deliberate prior calculation, the placing of a marker at a price he had already decided he was willing to pay. 4. He had lost people. He had lost people recently enough that the loss was still present in certain silences, but long enough ago that he had developed a functional relationship with it. He worked among people who were going to die at a rate that made functional relationships with loss non-optional, and he had chosen, at some point that preceded Cade's knowledge of him, to treat this as a feature of his situation rather than an exception to it. He mourned cleanly and moved on and did not use his grief as a resource. Cade found this the most instructive thing about him. 5. He believed something about what was outside the walls that he had not said to the class. This was legible in the specific quality of the omissions in his teaching, the moments where a sentence ended before it needed to end, where an explanation covered the minimum necessary and did not pursue its own implications. He was not deceiving them. He was managing the release of information according to a schedule that Cade had not been given, and could only infer from the shape of what wasn't there. 6. On the morning after Wren's death, before the class was awake, Cade had passed by the small room at the end of the compound corridor that served as Vex's office, and had seen, through the half-open door, Vex sitting at his desk not doing anything, not writing, not reading, not reviewing any of the papers that were stacked on the desk's surface, just sitting in the pre-dawn dark, with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes at a middle distance, in the posture of someone being alone with something that required company and couldn't have it. Cade had not stopped. He had walked past and said nothing. But he had understood something about Vex that he had not understood before. He was not unchanged by what happened to the people around him. He had simply decided long ago that being changed was not the same as being stopped. Interlude. The evening before winter operations. The evening before, the class shipped out for the winter operations that would end with Dex and Colt telling the truth. 4 of them were on the roof of the compound's eastern building. It was cold. Raven had her jacket zipped to the chin. Elliot was wearing 2 scarves, the second of which was actually a long piece of fabric repurposed from something else, folded twice. Wren had produced, from somewhere, as she produced things, a small container of something warm that she described only as not officially rations, which he was sharing with Cade, who had been sharing back the piece of supplemental bread he'd saved from dinner. "Do you think we'll go further this time?" Wren asked. "The orders suggest it," Elliot said. "Extended kit, communication equipment at range. They're not sending us 12 kilometers with 4-day supplies. So we'll see more. We'll see more." She looked at the horizon. In the cold air, the arc lights at the wall perimeter were particularly sharp, the halos around them crisper than they were in summer. "I want to see the open land," she said, "past the buffer zone. past the ruins. I want to see what the land looks like when it's just land, not form or anything, just itself. It's probably just grass, Coyd said. I know. I want to see the grass. She looked at him sideways. You know what I mean. He did. He didn't say so. Raven said, the reconnaissance reports from the 60-kilometer patrol described grassland in some sections. Open, some tree cover, what looked like an old highway still partially intact. They described it? I read the report in the archive room, Raven said. The access clearance for Class 104 covers retrospective patrol documentation. Elliot looked at her. You've been reading the archive reports. Some of them. Which ones? The ones relevant to the northern sector. The ones from before I was trained. She looked at the perimeter lights. There are gaps, she said. What kind of gaps? The kind that aren't data loss. The kind that look selected. She was quiet for a moment. There are patrol reports from before the collapse that are in the archive, from before the iron wall came down. They describe what the outer zone was like. She paused. And then there's a period of approximately 16 months before the collapse where the reports stop entirely. Not gaps in the data. The reports are there, they were filed, they're in the system, but the content has been redacted. Every one of them. The four of them sat with this. 16 months, Elliot said. 16 months. Before the wall came down. Yes. Cade thought about his father's notebook. The entries from the last 2 years, the oblique references, the careful not saying. The last entry, I think I know where it is. He had not told the others about the notebook yet. He was not sure why. Something in him was holding it, turning it over, waiting until he understood more of what it meant before he gave it to the larger conversation. He thought, 16 months. He thought, my father started writing differently. Approximately 2 years before the collapse, he thought whatever was being redacted, he was seeing the edges of it. When we come back from winter operations, he said, I have something to tell you. They looked at him. After, he said, after we know what we find out there. Wren looked at him. Her expression was the open, direct one, the one that did not strategize about what to ask and simply asked. Is it big? She said. I think so, he said. She nodded. Okay. She took another sip of the not officially ration's warmth. Then after. They sat on the roof. In the cold, with the arc lights and the horizon, and the thing that was waiting on the other side of the winter operations. And they were 4 people who had gotten used to each other's company in a way that felt, in those months, like a kind of permanence. It was not permanent. Nothing was. But that night it felt like it. And that was its own kind of thing. Truly, the end of Part 1. Iron. Interlude. What? The wall knew. The iron wall was built in 2032. This was the official record. In the archive documents that Raven had been reading in the evenings after training, the ones with access clearance for Class 104, the ones that stopped being useful 16 months before the collapse, the construction of the iron wall was described in the language of emergency infrastructure. Rapid deployment, standardized, reinforced steel panels, the engineering compromises that came with building something very large very quickly, with the resources of a civilization in the process of not collapsing, but instead deciding to enclose itself. What the official record said, the walls were built in response to the outbreak. The outbreak began in 2031. The walls were completed by 2032. 3 concentric barriers, iron on the outside, copper in the middle, silver at the center, sized to contain and sustain a population of approximately 400,000 people. What the official record didn't say, who exactly made the decision to build them? Who had drawn the plans before the need existed? Who had determined in advance of the outbreak being widespread enough to require a response, that the response would be walls of this precise design and these dimensions, be squeezed in this specific location, in the middle of what used to be the American Midwest. What Elliot had noted in the margins of his map in small script near the bottom edge, the logistics of construction,
Resources, labor, design, materials are inconsistent with a rapid emergency response. The iron wall was planned. The planning preceded the emergency it was a response to. He had told Cade this on a Tuesday evening in the 4th month of training, in the way he told Cade most things as a finding, set on the table for examination, without urgency but also without softening. "You're saying someone knew," Cade had said. "I'm saying the wall shows evidence of being built by someone who knew what was coming before most people did," Elliot had said. "I'm not sure that's the same as who knew." Yes, and decided to build a wall instead of something else. Instead of, or in addition to. We don't know the full picture. They had sat with that. Cade had thought then about his father's notebook, the entries that described something he'd found in the maintenance depot that didn't match what maintenance work was supposed to involve. The sketches in the margins that might have been infrastructure diagrams and might have been something else. He had not yet opened the notebook at that point. He would later, and when he did, one of the things he would find in it was a drawing his father had made, detailed, precise, with the care of someone who drew the things they wanted to understand, of a section of the iron walls and internal structure that was not in any official maintenance document, a section that contained something that was not, as far as anyone's maintenance records indicated, part of the wall. Something that had been built into the wall when the wall was built, something that had been there the whole time. His father had written beneath the drawing, in the forward slanting script, "This was always the plan. I don't know whose, I don't know why. I'm going to find out." He had gone to find out the next morning. The wall had come down the same day. In the early months of Class 104, before the first field mission, and before the deaths and before the things that could not be untold, Cade had a habit of waking before the class roll at 5:30. He would lie in his bunk in the pre-dawn dark and listen to the compound and think about the iron wall. Not about his mother. He had gotten reasonably functional at not thinking about his mother in the early morning hours, which were the hours when grief was most mobile and most likely to expand to fill available space if you let it. He thought about the wall itself, the structure of it, the way it had stood for a year after the collapse, and then hadn't, the question of what had changed. He had always assumed the zombies, the things that came from outside. Whatever had accumulated or organized outside the wall in the year after the collapse, and then had come through it. What Elliot's note suggested, and what his father's notebook, when he finally read it, confirmed, was that this assumption was not complete. That the wall had been planned in advance, that something inside the wall's own structure had been part of the plan all along. He had always been looking out toward the things that came through. He had not until now thought carefully about what might have been looking back. On a night in the 5th month of training, Wren had asked him something he had not expected. They were sitting on the roof, just the two of them, Elliot having gone to bed early on account of a headache that he described as the consequence of having accumulated more data than my current model can accommodate, which was his version of being overwhelmed and not wanting to say so. "Do you trust Vex?" Wren asked. He thought about it. "Yes," he said, "within limits." "What limits?" "He knows things he's not telling us. He has reasons for that. I think his reasons are probably good ones, but they're his reasons, not mine." He paused. "So I trust him with my life. I don't trust him to tell me everything. Is that enough?" "For now," he said. "What about you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think I trust him more than almost anyone else I can think of," she said. "Which is different from trusting him a lot. It just means the alternatives are worse." He looked at her. "That's not very reassuring." "No," she agreed, "but I'd rather know it's true than pretend it isn't." She looked at the horizon. "My dad used to say that trust was a thing you built incrementally, not given, built, and that the building required information." She paused. "We don't have all the information yet, so the trust is incomplete. But what we have so far is real." He thought about this. "What would the information do," he asked, "when we have it, to the trust?" "Extend it or break it," she said simply. "Either way, I'd rather know." He sat with that.
The specific Wren Calloway version of things, her insistence on reality, on having the actual picture rather than the comfortable one, on knowing the difference between the trust that was real and the trust that was wished for.
It was a kind of courage he didn't have a name for. Not the courage to act in danger, the courage to want the truth even when the truth might cost you the things you'd built in its absence. He thought, I want to be able to do that. He thought, I'm not sure I am yet.
He looked at the horizon and thought about his father's notebook, still closed in the drawer, and about all the things he had been not knowing, because not knowing was functional, and about the morning that was coming when he would have to stop not knowing and deal with what was actually there, not yet, but coming. End of Part 1. Iron. A final note on Irongate. What was left of Irongate 5 years after the wall came down was not nothing. The structures stood, most of them. The material world was stubborn in ways that the human world was not. It did not evacuate, did not relocate, did not require administrative processing or ration allocation or a bed in a converted gymnasium. It simply stayed. The row houses on Milburn Street with the higher-than-standard curb. The shed roof that Cade had climbed every summer morning. The kitchen window through which a thin ribbon of smoke had drifted on a Tuesday in August. What was gone was the hum of it. The specific frequency of occupied places, the radio broadcasts and the cartwheels and the calling of names and the background noise of 400,000 people going about the business of being alive. That was gone. What remained was the container without the thing it had contained, which was its own kind of ruin. In the years after the evacuation, the scout teams that ventured into the old Irongate zone filed reports that included, as a category, what they called structural integrity assessments. The assessments were practical. Which buildings were load-bearing, which had been compromised, which zones were safe for scout movement, and which were not. They were not intended to be elegies, but in reading them in the archive room, Raven had noticed something. The reports contained in their margins and their incidental detail a catalog of the specific texture of a place that had been alive and was not anymore. The school with the math problem on the chalkboard. The market stalls with goods still on the shelves behind broken glass. The library with the books still in order on the shelves. The catalog cards still in the drawers. Someone had cared enough to note these things even in a military assessment. She had thought about this for a long time. She had concluded that the people who went out there, who walked through the specific remains of a life that had been interrupted, could not entirely not see it, could not turn off the part themselves that understood what they were walking through, and so it ended up in the margins of their reports as unofficial and accurate. The record of what it looked like when 40,000 lives stopped in the middle of what they were doing and didn't come back. She had thought about the child's drawing, the house with the smoke and the sun and the two stick figures. She had thought, somebody drew that. Somebody is still alive who drew that. That child is somewhere in Copper Wall, grown enough to be in training or on labor assignment, carrying around the memory of a classroom they left and an ordinary morning that turned into something else. She had thought, we carry the things we carry. We don't get to put them down. The only question is whether we carry them in ways that let us keep moving. She had decided, at some point, that she couldn't precisely locate what had been a gradual decision, the kind that assembled itself from many smaller decisions made in the daily course of things. That she was going to keep moving, whatever that required, for as long as it took. Now truly the end of Part 1. Iron.